Good morning. Welcome to the December 2019 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission, or in recognition of our guest, Senator Kennedy, I'll call it our public meeting of December 2019. Madam Secretary, could you please introduce the agenda for the morning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and good morning, Commissioners. Good morning. For today's meeting, you will hear 8 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would propose to designate 988 as the 3-digit number for a national suicide prevention and mental health crisis hotline. Second, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would take a fresh and comprehensive look at the rules for the 5.9 gigahertz band and propose, among other things, to make the lower 45 megahertz of the band available for unlicensed operations and to permit cellular vehicle to everything operations in the upper 20 megahertz of the band. Third, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would seek comment on removing the existing non-federal allocations in the 3.3 to 3.355 gigahertz band as a step towards potential future shared use between federal incumbents and commercial users. Fourth, you will consider an order on remand and declaratory ruling that would promote continued investment in IP-based networks by clarifying that a local exchange carrier partnering with a VoIP provider may assess end-office switched access charges only if the carrier or its VoIP partner provides a physical connection to the last-mile facilities used to serve the end user. Fifth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would seek comment on modernizing requirements for notices cable operators must provide consumers and local franchise authorities. Sixth, you will consider an enforcement action. Seventh, you will consider an enforcement action. And eighth, you will consider an enforcement action. This is your agenda for today. Please note item 6 listed in the Commission's December 5th, 2019 Sunshine Notice and entitled Reexamination of the Comparative Standards and Procedures for Licensing Non-Commercial Educational Broadcast Stations and Low-Power FM Stations has been adopted by the Commission and deleted from today's agenda. The first item, entitled Implementation of the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act of 2018, will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau, and Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And in all seriousness, I do want to welcome Senator Kennedy and his staff to our meeting today. Enjoy. It's about to be a riveting show. Ms. Monteith, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and to the other commissioners.
Good morning.
The Wireline Competition Bureau is pleased to present for your consideration a notice of proposed rulemaking that would, if adopted, start the process of designating a simple, easy-to-remember 3-digit dialing code for a national suicide prevention and mental health crisis hotline to ease access to crisis services, reduce the stigma surrounding suicide and mental health conditions, and improve the effectiveness of suicide prevention efforts. I would like to thank the Bureau team for their hard work on this item, as well as our colleagues in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau and the Offices of Economics and Analytics and General Counsel for their review and helpful input. Seated at the table from the Wireline Competition Bureau and the Competition Policy Division are Dewana Terry, Associate Bureau Chief, Pam Arluck, Division Chief, Heather Hendrickson, Deputy Division Chief, Michelle Slater, Attorney Advisor, and Celia Lewis, Attorney Advisor. I'd also like to recognize the contributions of Dan Kahn, Associate Bureau Chief, who unfortunately could not be here with us this morning. Celia will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The notice before you proposes to designate a 3-digit dialing code for a national suicide and mental health crisis hotline, and it proposes 988 as that 3-digit code. The notice further proposes that calls to 988 would be directed to the existing National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or Lifeline. Rapid access to suicide prevention and mental health crisis intervention services have never been more critical for Americans. Since 2008, suicide has ranked as the 10th leading cause of death for all ages in the United States. According to the CDC, from 1999 to 2016, suicide increased in 49 of 50 states, and in more than half of those states, the increase was greater than 20%. Moreover, suicide rates are higher in rural America. In 2017, the rate in most rural counties was 1.8 times the rate for the most urban counties in the country. Additionally, suicide rates are higher across various at-risk populations, including veterans and the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer LGBTQ communities and teens. Between 2008 and 2016, there were more than 6,000 veteran suicides each year. LGBTQ youth contemplate suicide at a rate almost 3 times higher than heterosexual youth, and more than 500,000 LGBTQ youth will attempt suicide this year. The CDC also reports that suicide is the second most common cause of death among teenagers and young adults. In 2017, the rate of suicide by teenage girls hit a 40-year high, and between 1999 and 2014, the rate of suicide committed by girls ages 10 to 14 tripled. A recent study also found that self-reported suicide attempts among Black teens increased by 73% between 1991 and 2017. In recognition of the need to ease access to potentially life-saving resources, Congress passed the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act of 2018. That statute tasked the Commission with examining and reporting on the technical feasibility of designating a shorter number, a simple, easy-to-remember 3-digit dialing code for a national suicide prevention and mental health crisis hotline. With valuable input from the Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, known as SAMHSA, the Department of Veteran Affairs, and the North American Numbering Council, FCC staff issued its report to Congress in August 2019. Consistent with the FCC staff report, the notice proposes to designate a 3-digit dialing code for a national suicide prevention and mental health crisis hotline. The notice anticipates that the lifeline, which is currently accessible by calling 1-800-273-8255, would be more effective if it were accessible via a simple, easy-to-remember 3-digit number. In addition, based on the FCC staff's report's examination of the feasibility of using existing N11 codes, as well as the use of a non-N11 3-digit code, the notice proposes designating 988 because it appears to provide the fastest and therefore best path to implementing a 3-digit dialing code. Further, the notice proposes requiring that all telecommunications carriers and interconnected VoIP service providers make, within 18 months, any network changes necessary to ensure that users can dial 988 to reach the lifeline from anywhere in the country. The notice also seeks comment on all aspects of implementation, including whether a longer or shorter time frame would be needed to make 988 a reality. Finally, the notice assesses the benefits and costs of designating and implementing 988. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lewis, for that presentation and for the great work that all of you have done on this important item. With that, we'll turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this item and all the work that has gone into it. I do want to say there is a portion of people out there that no matter what number is chosen, no matter how easy it is to dial, will make no difference. They have made a choice and they're headed down a different direction. I have some experience on this. My brother-in-law left this world 2.5 months ago under his own hand, and it didn't matter what number was going to be out there. His personality and his direction and where he was headed it wouldn't have mattered but this is about other people. These are about those that we can convince. These are about those that are willing to listen, that can be driven in a different direction, that can be shown a path of where life matters. So I pray that this item has the impact that we expect it to. I like the idea of a short code and different things, and I know people are talking about texting and other things, so I like where this is going. I appreciate the work that's gone into it, and I hope it really does save lives. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you. Suicide is a national tragedy. More than 47,000 Americans died by suicide in 2017. That's more people than died in this country from car accidents, to put that in perspective. More than 20 veterans commit suicide every day as they deal with adjusting from the horror of war to finding a path in civilian life. Suicide and attendant mental health challenges have received far too little attention for far too long. And that's now changing. And importantly, the conversation about mental health is changing. Because how we talk about these challenges matters. After all, feelings of isolation and crisis, those aren't experiences that happen to them or others or those people over there. What we're talking about is what our parents feel, what our kids feel, and what we feel. Anything that we can do to break down barriers, to make it easier for conversations about mental health and counseling to feel within reach, is something we should do. And that's why I want to commend Chairman Pai for leading the FCC's work to play our part in this effort. We can bring attention to this issue and help to those in need. There's already a network of 163 crisis centers that are part of a national suicide prevention lifeline. They answer over 2.2 million calls per year and more than 100,000 online chats. They are a life-saving resource. But not enough Americans know about this help or might not know the number, which is 1-800-273-8255. Shortening that number to 988, as we propose to do today, could make a difference, as a broad range of stakeholders have already indicated with their support. So I'm proud to support this notice. I want to thank the staff of the Wireline Bureau for your work on this very important item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Every day in this country, thousands and thousands of people call the National Suicide and Mental Health Hotline with a plea for help and a cry for support. They are in crisis, but we are in crisis too. That's because suicide is on the rise, and as you've heard, it is now the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. More than 6,000 veterans commit suicide each year. 500,000 lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer youth will attempt suicide this year alone. And last year, more first responders died by suicide than in the line of duty. On top of this, the rate of suicide committed by teen girls is at a 40-year high. These facts are not easy to hear, because for those of us who have lost family or friends they loved, myself included, they are cruel reminders of birthdays missed, holidays gone, and words of encouragement that were never received. So that is why what we do here today is important. In response to the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act, today we start a rulemaking to set aside an easy-to-remember 3-digit dialing code for a national suicide and mental health crisis hotline. How we implement this, of course, matters. So we ask for input on the details to get this done, including just how calls will be routed and how to implement the 3-digit code in areas where it is already used at the start of a 7-digit phone number. I want to thank my colleagues for making some changes to this rulemaking at my request. In particular, I appreciate their willingness to highlight the growing suicide rates of young women. I also want to thank them for including a question about how texting fits into this discussion. You see, texting is primary for so many young people, And it would be a mistake for us to build a system that presumes talk is the only starting point for discussion. Nonetheless, I worry that in a deregulatory rush last year, this agency announced that texting was outside of our authority, and we did so without fully considering the consequences. It would be a shame if that limits what we do and cuts off so many individuals, and especially young people, who reach out first and foremost through text. Thank you to the Bureau for this work. This has my full support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you look at your children, whether they're a toddler or somebody strolling along with their parent at a grocery store, you cannot help but notice a twinkle in their eyes. They feel as though the world is full of infinite possibilities, demonstrated by, of course, the imaginative games that our kids play and their dream career choices of becoming a president, a unicorn trainer, or a doctor, or in my case, all three at the same time. My daughter wants to be a president, unicorn trainer, doctor. But as adults, it is our duty to protect the hopes and dreams of our children, no matter their race, their gender identity, their sexual orientation. And however, the number of suicidal deaths and attempts show us that we're not doing enough. And so I'll cite some of the grave statistics that have been formed in the record that matter to me. Research shows that 1991 to 2017 self-reported suicide attempts for Black adolescents rose by 73%. Research also shows that the suicide is the second leading cause of death for African American adolescents in this country. That combined with what we heard about women and young girls, and in particular the LGBTQ group, these are nothing short of a crisis. Today's NPRM addresses a pressing need for expanded access to suicide prevention and mental health crisis services for children, teens, and the millions of other Americans impacted by suicide. Establishing a simple 3-digit number for the National Suicide Prevention Hotline will better connect those in need with those life-saving services, and I recognize that there are some technical challenges that we do need to address here, but I look forward to reviewing the robust record that we're going to establish here and how we can meet this urgent, critical need as quickly as possible. And beyond today's item, the Commission and I have called for and must do more to help connect Americans, particularly our most vulnerable citizens, with health care services. Quality health care depends on access to doctors and other providers, and for many Americans, in-person visits just aren't possible because resources are too far away. Health conditions make travel difficult, or there simply aren't enough providers to go around. And according to the Health Resource and Services Administration, 112 million Americans live in areas where there is a shortage of mental health providers. This situation is particularly acute for children and adolescents. And so earlier this year, I visited Duke University's Integrated Pediatric Mental Health Group, which is working to address the severe shortage of child psychiatrists in North Carolina by providing telephone consultations and primary care providers who lack access to these specialists. And during my visit, Dr. Gary Maslow emphasized that just in North Carolina's experience, it is reflective of a nationwide crisis. Across the country, 8,500 child psychiatrists are treating patients, and Duke estimates that we need as much as 2,500 more. And so I've emphasized in our many discussions telehealth programs and broadband, bringing back the house call in a way that can expand the reach of doctors, mental health professionals, and other providers. And this will be a game changer. But we have to have communities in mind that are on the wrong side of that digital divide. So low-income people, people of color, people in rural areas, either that are not online, can't get online, or are making great sacrifices in order to get connected. And anchor institutions, hotspot lending programs, and other community efforts do their best to fill the gap. Fully realizing the benefit of online health care requires the certainty and privacy of high-quality broadband. So we need to redouble our efforts on internet inequality and should be a focus of the FCC's efforts going forward for suicide prevention. I do thank the Bureau for your hard work. I used to work with Ms. Celia Lewis. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you, Commissioner. On August 12th of 2014, the day after legendary actor and comedian Robin Williams died, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline received the highest daily call volume in its history. The director of the Lifeline credited the increase in calls to mention of the hotline number 1-800-273-TALK or 1-800-273-8255 in media coverage of Mr. Williams' death. More recently, on April 28, 2017, the rapper Logic released his song 1-800-273-8255. The song told listeners who were in crisis that they were not alone and that help was available. And as a result, the Lifeline had its second highest daily call volume up to that point. These events indicate that awareness of the Lifeline will lead more Americans to reach out and to seek help. Indeed, as the CEO of one of the Lifeline's crisis centers has explained, and I quote, "The hurdle we've always had is getting people to know how to find us." Well, that hurdle is a significant problem because, as we have heard, the need for suicide prevention services has never been greater in modern times. Indeed, the suicide rate in the United States is at its highest level since World War II. In 2017, more than 47,000 Americans died by suicide. 1.4 million adults made an attempt. And as we have heard, this crisis is disproportionately affecting at-risk populations. More than 20 veterans die by suicide each and every day. More than 500,000 LGBTQ youth will attempt suicide this year alone. The sad statistics go on from there. A shorter and simpler suicide hotline number could be a game changer for these and other people. And that is why we are proposing to designate an easy-to-remember 3-digit dialing code, 988, for a national suicide prevention and mental health hotline. 988 has an echo of the 911 number we all know as an emergency number. And we believe that this 3-digit number, dedicated for this purpose, will help ease access to crisis services. It'll reduce the stigma surrounding suicide and mental health conditions. And ultimately, it'll save lives. Now, of course, easier access to the Lifeline will mean increased call for and greater demand for crisis services, which in turn will require increased resources. And so as we move forward with this proceeding, we encourage interested stakeholders to work directly with Congress and our federal partners who run the Lifeline, the Department of Health and Human Services Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and the Department of Veterans Affairs to help increase the overall effectiveness of the Lifeline. These efforts may include specialized hotline services to address the needs of at-risk populations, such as veterans and LGBTQ youth. Now, this effort has benefited greatly from the support of and collaboration of members of Congress, mental health groups, and organizations representing communities who will particularly feel the impact of easier access to this Lifeline. I especially want to thank former Senator Orrin Hatch, Senator Cory Gardner, and Representatives Chris Stewart and Seth Moulton. I also want to thank SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Mental Health and Suicide Prevention, the National Council on Behavioral Health, Centerstone, the Trevor Project, and the LGBT Technology Partnership and Institute for their work on this issue. And of course, this could not be possible without the tremendous work of our FCC staff. For their outstanding work on this vitally important item, I'd like to thank staff from the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of General Counsel, and in my office, Nurali Patel, who worked many, many long hours over many months to get to this result. This item has my full support, and I dare say the support of millions across this country who are struggling. With that, we will vote on the item. Commissioner Riley?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks again for your great work, all of you. Madam Secretary, can you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next item will be presented by the Office of Engineering and Technology and is entitled Use of the 5.85 to 5.925 gigahertz band. Julius Knapp, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And to our distinguished Chief of the Office of Engineering and Technology, we turn our eyes and ears to you.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. That's a tough item to follow. Heart-wrenching, and I think it just reflects how important the work of this agency is to all of the American people. So thank you all. So it's with mixed emotions that I sit at this table today because this will be my last presentation of an item to the commission. Did I already get a negative vote? Is that I did a little research to check on the first time I presented an item before the commission, and as I recall, it was in the early 1980s when we were presenting an item to make spectrum available for 46 and 49 megahertz cordless telephones. It was so long ago that I couldn't find a video of that. I think it was because it was before they invented film. So I've had the privilege of presenting many items since then, and I lost count a long time ago. But one item I do recall is an order way back in 1999 to allocate 75 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band for intelligent transportation services. The Commission took this action with great hope for improving highway safety and enabling the introduction of new transportation services. And unfortunately, the promise of 20 years ago has mostly remained that, a promise. Meanwhile, at about the same time, Wi-Fi was first introduced. In contrast, Wi-Fi has flourished and evolved through multiple generations of ever-improving technology that's seemingly deployed just about everywhere, not only here in the United States, but around the world. In fact, Wi-Fi is available as an attractive feature in many of today's cars. So it's time to take a fresh look at that 75 megahertz at 5.9 gigahertz. The item we will present today does just that, still providing for intelligent transportation services with the hope of sparking widespread deployment and at the same time providing additional spectrum to accommodate the growth of Wi-Fi and other unlicensed technologies. With me at the table are Howard Griboff, Ira Kelch, and Paul Murray. And I'd leave for the chairman to list the other people who worked hard on this item. Howard will present the item. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. The item before you takes a fresh look at the 75 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band. The notice of proposed rulemaking contains a plan that can reboot this long underused but incredibly important mid-band spectrum. For 2 decades, the 5.9 gigahertz band has been designated for use by the Dedicated Short-Range Communications, or DSRC. The expectation was that DSRC equipment operating in the band would be widely deployed in cars and along roadways to provide for the transportation and vehicle safety-related spectrum needs of the intelligent transportation system. Today's decision to revisit use of the band is informed by the relatively slow deployment of DSRC, the evolution of newer transportation technologies, and the exploding growth in the use of Wi-Fi and other unlicensed devices. The NPRM proposes a win-win for transportation and unlicensed uses of the spectrum. As you see on the PowerPoint slide, the lower 45 megahertz portion of the band would be available for unlicensed operations, and the upper 30 megahertz portion of the band would be available for transportation and vehicle safety-related purposes. The proposed unlicensed portion of the band could be combined with existing unlicensed spectrum in adjacent frequencies to provide cutting-edge, high-throughput broadband applications on channels up to 160 megahertz wide. The upper 30 megahertz would be used for transportation services. The proposal specifically calls for the upper 20 megahertz to be dedicated to Cellular Vehicle to Everything, or CV2X, which is a newer vehicular communication standard that is designed to use the same sort of technology as today's commercial wireless networks. The item asks whether to designate the remaining 10 megahertz for CV2X or retain that 10 megahertz for DSRC. The NPRM sets forth technical rules that would govern the transportation and unlicensed uses in the 5.9 gigahertz band, and would address matters relative to incumbent operations, including interference protections for federal government radars operating in this spectrum, and considerations relative to entities licensed under the Commission's existing rules. Finally, the NPRM seeks comment on the extent to which the transportation and vehicle safety functions originally contemplated under the DSRC model are being or are anticipated to be provided in other bands or through other means. The item looks at the 30 megahertz of 5.9 gigahertz spectrum in the context of today's larger and more modern ecosystem, in which spectrum bands and technologies that were not available 20 years ago can work together to further improve safety in the transportation environment, which remains a significant national objective. Staff recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges solely for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Mr. Crow, for that presentation. And Julie, we will have more, I suspect, to say about you at the end, so I will save my remarks for now. So, gear up, my friend. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Yeah, and I'll add to that and say, Julie, just let me say thank you. There'll be another opportunity to fetch your career, and I'll be there. And we'll talk about this at the end as well. And moreover, thank you for your work on this item. You and I have talked about this for quite a while. Yes. To finally get here is pretty celebratory. I have a couple of prepared remarks that I'll add. There are not enough words to express how pleased I am that we finally started proceeding to consider the future of the 5.9 gigahertz band. After many years of waiting and many twists and turns, this is a great victory for the American people and serves as recognition that sound spectrum policy can triumph over stale rhetoric. The fact is that 2 decades have passed since this band was designated for dedicated short-range communication systems, commonly referred to as DSRC, and the spectrum still remains, at least by any rational person's estimation, highly underutilized. For 20 years, the Commission has awaited the great promise of vehicular safety DSRC apps to materialize. But what we have actually received are a few localized systems and limited equipment in a discontinued car line. I think it is safe to conclude that this is not a success story by any measure. I am in full agreement with the proposal to reallocate 45 megahertz for unlicensed use and 30 megahertz for vehicular safety systems. In fact, the chairman's proposal is near identical to an idea I discussed publicly and pushed for adoption years ago, as it was consistent with one of the competing industry proposals at the time. It is still the most logical path forward on this band. In particular, it effectively solves the interference issue by splitting the band into 2, preserving an exclusive portion dedicated to automobile safety. The lower part of the 5.9 gigahertz band is prime spectrum, adjacent to the 5 gigahertz spectrum that is the Wi-Fi workhorse, and is the obvious and ideal choice, along with 6 gigahertz, for much-needed expansion of unlicensed opportunities. And I won't repeat here and now the multitude of consumer benefits for bringing forth new unlicensed spectrum, which Commissioner Rosenworcel and I have talked about many times. Suffice it to say, 45 megahertz will be used actively by the unlicensed community to bring amazing technological innovation and capabilities forward, far exceeding anything we can imagine today. I firmly agree that 30 megahertz should provide ample spectrum for vehicular safety applications, be it C-V2X, DSRC, or both, especially if you talk to the engineers and examine the similar efforts occurring internationally. To be clear, I would have preferred a more technology-neutral approach over proposing to allocate certain portions of the remaining band for a specific technology, but it will work for this stage of the process. Regardless of how these 30 megahertz are or are not divvied up between the old DSRC technology and the emerging C-V2X, which appears to have surpassed DSRC in both functionality and popularity, many of the offerings that were originally planned for the 5.9 gigahertz band are already being provided using other spectrum bands. Remember that the Commission has supplied the automobile industry with spectrum to support their radar and LiDAR systems that are used for crash avoidance, and autonomous driving vehicle technologies have been developed using other frequencies. Nonetheless, newer 5.9 gigahertz systems may be able to address one glaring need, helping to alert drivers and thus prevent accidents when there's no line of sight. For instance, this is critically important when two cars approach an intersection from two different directions and cannot see each other because they're blocked by a building. To the extent that these systems can be deployed to save lives, this 30 megahertz of spectrum could be well utilized. I thank my colleagues for agreeing to my edits to propose a clarification that this band be used to provide safety services. Under no circumstances should we provide valuable spectrum resources in this critical location for any offerings that are not safety-related, commercially available, or that are offered using other spectrum. Given all the safety rhetoric expended on this issue, I dare anyone to claim that this 30 megahertz block should be used for anything other than safety of life. Further, I appreciate the addition of a question about steps the Commission can take to assure that these safety applications are actually deployed. If these systems are as important as some in the automobile industry assert, and I have seen demonstrations that certainly show CVDX as promising, they should be deployed with all due haste. We should not have to wait another 20 years with little progress along the way. And if these safety applications do not develop, we shouldn't take another 20 years to further evaluate and reallocate the band either. Some may try to say that the Commission is taking away spectrum from the automobile industry, which will lead to increased auto fatalities and that we are putting vehicular safety in jeopardy. Or that we're doing horrible things just to enable faster internet connections, sharing Facebook timelines, or posting Instagram pics. That is pure gibberish. Everyone on this dais wants our families, friends, neighbors, countrymen, and women to be safe when traveling in motor vehicles. But DSRC has not come anywhere close to fruition. As this NPRM contemplates, we can simultaneously pursue both automobile safety and unlicensed innovation. It is one reason why the bulk of automobile manufacturers have come to recognize the wisdom and forward thinking of this item. Another round of attack will likely come from those who argue that if a portion of the 5.9 gigahertz band is lost, there will never be any more automobile safety in the future. Again, this is false. To the extent there's a demonstrable spectrum need in the future for automobile safety, the Commission will likely give it full consideration. And we have a track record to prove it. The Commission did exactly that with regards to vehicular radars just a few years ago. Moreover, even if, and that's an exceptionally big if, it is still a viable technology, DSRC has moved beyond the standard that is codified in our rules. So we must act to complete an update for any deployment to occur. Without this proceeding, there is no DSRC, no CVDX, no unlicensed, and maybe, most importantly, no certainly for any investment in this band, period. For all these reasons, I thank the chairman for moving this notice. I look forward to continuing to engage with interested parties on this matter and to going to final order as soon as possible so this band can finally be used effectively and efficiently. We must not wait or be delayed further in getting this done. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. The conversation around U.S. leadership in 5G has tended to focus on two topics: infrastructure and spectrum. Licensed spectrum, in particular, tends to grab the headlines with 5G. You can understand that, given the money involved. This week alone, we commenced an auction that's already raised about $1 billion in bids, and we also approved licenses from two prior auctions that netted around $3 billion. The high dollar sums involved with these licensed spectrum can obscure the key role that unlicensed spectrum plays in securing U.S. leadership in 5G. You can see the value of Wi-Fi in so many contexts. It powers the primary internet access point for most Americans, the one in their home. Most wireless traffic is handled on Wi-Fi. And without Wi-Fi offloading, our commercial wireless networks would strain to meet demand. Yet there are even more ways in which unlicensed spectrum will be critical to the growing 5G ecosystem. Take augmented reality as an example. AR promises to bring the knowledge and computational power of the internet into our lives without the need to stare at a phone or click through until we find an answer. AR, when fully implemented, should sense what we're doing and provide assistance, directions, recommendations, and warnings without our prompting. Its power is in disintermediating the internet and life, eliminating the distraction of a device, which might be the opening words to one of the worst rap songs ever to be written. Think about it for a second. To really work, this requires what we've come to describe as 5G performance. AR needs a network that can respond in an instant. AR needs a network that can push data to the user quickly to provide rich graphics and video. And AR needs a network with capacity to handle the multitude of devices that Americans will demand. 5G networks using licensed spectrum can provide this performance. But in many cases, unlicensed spectrum will serve as the final link between the cloud and the consumer's device. And that's because unlicensed spectrum, at least in the near term, may be cost-advantaged for delivering massive data streams, may conserve battery life, and may assist in bridging the time for designers and technologists to improve the form factors of 5G devices, especially wearables. To stimulate the services, devices, and ultimately the networks that make 5G meaningful to everyday Americans, we must have a 5G ecosystem that works everywhere Americans are. 5G services must work well at home and in the car, at a coffee shop, and in a park. And that means we will need a lot of unlicensed spectrum to help power 5G devices. The good news is that much of this challenge has already been met. Cable providers have built gigabit speed capabilities to homes and businesses across their footprints. Billions of dollars of investment is made each year in upgrading those wired networks and in researching how to push them to higher gigabit speeds. The bottleneck soon may be not that last mile, but those last few feet or inches. As devices demand more data, as wired networks deliver more data, a lack of unlicensed spectrum, especially in the home, could leave all of that innovation for naught. So I'm proud of the Commission for getting ahead of this problem. We now have 580 megahertz of unlicensed spectrum in the 5 gigahertz band. The Commission is actively looking at 1,200 megahertz in the 6 and lower 7 gigahertz bands. And in between those large swaths of spectrum sits the small but mighty band we consider today. The 45 megahertz at the bottom of the 5.9 band that we propose to free up for unlicensed can be combined with a similar spectrum adjacent to it. And together, that would enable the first contiguous 160 megahertz channel for unlicensed devices, free of any need to use coordination technologies that could slow down throughput. This is the type of clear spectrum channels that Wi-Fi advocates have asked for in the 6 gigahertz band. And we have a chance through this item to meet that need starting in 5. And growing the 5G ecosystem requires smart spectrum policy. It requires low, mid, and high bands. And it requires both licensed and unlicensed. So I want to thank OET for its work on this item. I want to thank the chairman for moving this proceeding out of Park, where we had been stuck for far too long. It has my support, and I will reserve my notes on Julie for after the meeting, but at least for now, just say thank you so much for your service. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
All right, well, we're talking about spectrum in the upper portion of the 5 gigahertz band, so I want to keep this interesting, and I'm going to tell a story. And it starts last year. That's when I traveled to the University of Colorado to kick off a Silicon Flatirons conference. And let me say one thing about the organizers of this event. They really know how to get a party started. You see, they gathered us to discuss what they called the Spectrum Hall of Shame. And you know, a year later, I'm still trying to figure out if it was an honor or a slight that I was asked to get that conversation started. But the truth is, I think we can learn a lot from shame. I think owning up to our mistakes is powerful. It provides us with the opportunity to do better with what lays ahead. In fact, I think there is a deep undercurrent of optimism in studying what went wrong so that in the future we can get it right. This is true of so many things, spectrum policy included. And that brings me to the 5.9 gigahertz band that is the subject of today's rulemaking. And I'm going to start by saying it's hard to avoid the buzz about driverless cars. You can question if these vehicles are ready for prime time or quibble with the change they require to our roadways and civic life, but you can't deny that a lot is riding, literally, on the future of how we drive. But here's the thing. Enthusiasm for autonomous vehicles is not new. In fact, if you fall down the internet rabbit hole far enough looking into self-driving cars, eventually you'll land on Francis Houdina and the American Wonder. You see, all the way back in 1925, Francis Houdina founded a radio equipment firm called Houdina Radio Control Company. And from the get-go, this company was focused on reinventing transportation. In fact, it built the first radio-operated automobile. And here's how it happened. Houdina took a 1926 Chandler sedan and rigged it with an antenna. Then he set it up so that the radio signals it received operated small electric motors that controlled speed and direction. A crew trailing close behind in a second car maneuvered the remote-controlled Chandler, and he christened this makeshift effort the American Wonder. The American Wonder was the first driverless car to roll down the streets of New York City. Of course, Houdina made all the appropriate precautions, and by that I mean he clung to the running board of the car, ready to take the wheel in an emergency. Well, this demonstration did not end well. As the New York Times recounted it, the radio car careened from left to right, down Broadway, around Columbus Circle, and south on Fifth Avenue, running down 2 trucks and a milk wagon. At 43rd Street, after a crash into a fire engine was barely averted, the police put an end to the experiment. But here's where this failure succeeded. His demonstration captured the public's imagination. We still swoon at the prospect of autonomous driving. We still marvel about what it could mean for driving and for safety, and we still experiment, just not like he did on the streets of New York. And so it was at this agency in 1999, 2 decades ago, that we set aside 75 megahertz for spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band for dedicated short-range communications, or DSRC. So DSRC was designed so that cars could talk to each other in real life and help reduce accidents. As the FCC acknowledged, DSRC can improve safety by warning drivers of an impending condition on the road just in time to take corrective action. But in the 20 years since the FCC allocated this spectrum, that hasn't really happened. Today, autonomous vehicles have moved beyond DSRC to get around and communicate, whether that's with radar, LiDAR, cameras, sensors, onboard mapping tools, or new cellular technologies like Cellular Vehicle to Everything, or CV2X. Today, just a few thousand vehicles have DSRC on board out of the more than 260 million cars on the road. So let's be honest. Our bet on DSRC did not pan out the way we thought it would. In fact, the National Transportation Safety Board has said it will be up to 3 decades before the majority of vehicles on the road have DSRC capability, which is what is needed for this safety technology to be truly effective. 50 years from spectrum start to finish is a long time. And I don't know about you, but in 50 years, I'm hoping we have flying cars. So let me be clear. We should support automobile safety. However, our spectrum policies supporting safety need to be current. So we should speed the way for our thinking about these technologies to be totally up to date. And when we do, let's acknowledge other countries are doing this using less spectrum than the 75 megahertz that the United States initially set aside. And remember that, in fact, only a very small portion of those airwaves were actually set aside by the FCC for basic safety messaging. So it's time to take a fresh look at this band and see if we can update our commitment to safety and also develop more unlicensed opportunities for Wi-Fi. Now, this is a subject I have worked with my colleague, Commissioner O'Reilly, on for more than 4 years. and I want to commend him for his thought leadership, his willingness to work with me, and his perseverance. But it turns out that persistence pays off. And I also want to thank the chairman for finally moving forward and kicking off this discussion today. It's important because right now we use a lot of Wi-Fi, and our Wi-Fi airwaves are congested. Right now there are over 9 billion Wi-Fi enabled devices. We've got billions and billions more heading our way in the Internet of Things. And on top of that, we know that as much as 70% of 5G traffic is going to be offloaded onto Wi-Fi. Add it all up, and you see we're going to need a significant swath of unlicensed spectrum to keep up with demand. And the 5.9 gigahertz band is the ideal place to explore Wi-Fi expansion because it's adjacent to an existing unlicensed band. That means we have the opportunity to introduce new wideband channels, channels that will be able to take advantage of new standards and deliver on speeds faster than a gigabit per second. In other words, this is where we can start to develop next generation gigabit Wi-Fi. According to a report issued last year, opening the 5.9 gigahertz band for Wi-Fi like this could add between 60 and 105 billion to our gross domestic product. So I support today's effort, and I believe there's no shame in correcting course. And I think it's time to be ambitious and find a way forward that puts the 5.9 gigahertz band to fuller use. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Rosenworcel. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congress has tasked the FCC with developing a sustainable communications ecosystem that both meets public safety needs and allows new and innovative technologies to flourish. To do so, we must closely monitor and periodically adjust our spectrum allocations to respond to the needs of today and, of course, anticipate the needs of tomorrow. Today, we now revisit this decision to allocate 5.9 gigahertz band to dedicated short-range communications, DSRC, in light of the explosion of innovative and nearby Wi-Fi bands, the unmet potential of DSRC technology in consumer vehicles, and the promise of new cellular vehicle-to-everything technology, CV2X, as you heard. 20 years ago, the FCC saw promise in using wireless communication spectrum to make transportation safer. I believe that conclusion was correct. Intelligent transportation system services are critically important and will save lives. Unfortunately, DSRC has fallen well short of our expectations. And as of today, only one manufacturer has incorporated DSRC technology into its cars in the U.S., and even then into only one of those models. And so vehicle manufacturers instead use cellular networks and unlicensed spectrum to meet public safety and consumer needs, and are turning to 5G networks to implement functionality that was originally intended for the DSRC. CV2X did not exist even a few years ago. And so today we are proposing to use and dedicate up to 30 megahertz for its use. That's how quickly things change. I'm pleased that rather than continuing to be wed to a technology that appears to be stuck in neutral, this agency is showing it can shift into the fast lane. Our decision comes at an important time. The problem of internet inequality is resulting in significant different opportunities in terms of employment, education, civic engagement, for those, of course, with high-speed service and those without. The new unlicensed spectrum that we propose to make available today can play an important role in connecting people in those unserved areas and communities. In my travels, I've heard repeatedly about how unserved and underserved individuals rely on Wi-Fi in cities and anchor institutions like schools and libraries. Greater access to public Wi-Fi will help disconnected consumers access necessary government services, job opportunities, education, and training. This item also promises to help address another issue that disproportionately affects the vulnerable. Many of us have paid for fast home broadband service only to experience speeds or devices that struggle to connect, and the cause in many cases is congested Wi-Fi channels in that location. There simply is not enough Wi-Fi capacity to go around, and the big broadband stream to your home ends up getting reduced to a trickle by the time it gets to your device. And this happens regardless of whether you pay for 100 megabit speeds or a more affordable 15 megabits plan. Under the proposed approach, however, 5.9 can be joined with the adjacent unlicensed spectrum to create 160 megahertz of Wi-Fi channels, relieving some of that congestion and allowing consumers to make the very most of their broadband connections at whatever speeds they can afford. This will be particularly helpful for low-income consumers who are more likely to live in these dense urban areas that are subject to the worst Wi-Fi congestion. I do look forward to hearing from industry and others on these points. Finally, I'd like to thank Commissioners O'Reilly and Commissioner Rosenworcel for their leadership on these issues. Thank you, of course, also to OET and Will Reserve, but Julie, thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate your kicking into high gear with some of those references. I assure you, I'm going to be hitting the brakes on any more automotive puns in my statement. So. All right, back into character. Exactly 20 years ago, as we have heard, the FCC allocated 75 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band for a technology called Dedicated Short-Range Communications, or DSRC. DSRC was designed to facilitate motor vehicle-related communications, but it has not evolved as we expected. It's never been widely deployed, and in the meantime, a new wave of transportation communications technologies has emerged, as has demand for unlicensed spectrum. And so as a result, a lot of people, including up here on this dais, are wondering whether this valuable spectrum, a public resource, is really being put to its best use. In my view, it is not. After 2 decades of dormancy, the 5.9 gigahertz band deserves a fresh look by the FCC. And that is exactly what we are doing. In this notice, we tee up a balanced proposal that will advance both unlicensed wireless innovation and automotive safety technologies. The reason we are focusing in part on unlicensed operations is simple. Today, Wi-Fi is a staple of everyday life. It is the fabric that ties together all of our devices. It's become a foundational technology for the Internet of Things, connecting virtually any device or appliance that you can think of. Wi-Fi currently carries more than half of the Internet's traffic, and that share will only grow in the future. The next generation of Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi 6, based on the 802.11ax standard, is being rolled out this year and will provide better connections to multiple devices and better performance in congested environments. The economic value created by Wi-Fi in the United States alone is projected to double by 2023, reaching nearly $1 trillion. To fully realize Wi-Fi's potential, we need to make more spectrum available for unlicensed use. And that's just what the FCC is doing. In March, for example, we made over 21 gigahertz of spectrum above 95 gigahertz available for use by unlicensed devices. And we are working hard to free up spectrum in the 6 gigahertz band, what could be a massive 1,200 megahertz testbed for innovators and innovation. But here, we are proposing to designate the lower 45 megahertz of the 5.9 gigahertz band exclusively for unlicensed uses, like Wi-Fi. The adjacent 5.725 to 5.85 gigahertz band is currently available for unlicensed operations, making this 45 megahertz subband ideally suited for unlicensed use. Having more contiguous spectrum here is essential for the larger channels needed to support innovative use cases. Now, another part of our proposal advances the important cause of automotive safety. Specifically, we are proposing to reserve the remaining 30 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band exclusively for transportation-related communications technologies. And this is consistent with this agency's longstanding support for automotive safety during my tenure. Back in 2017, we ensured that there would be a large swath of contiguous spectrum in the 76 to 81 gigahertz band exclusively for vehicular radars. And these radars have proved especially useful for emergency braking and adaptive cruise control. One promising new technology that is gaining momentum in the automotive industry is cellular vehicle-to-everything, or CV2X as it is called. CV2X would use standard cellular protocols to provide direct communications between vehicles and, as the name suggests, everything. Other vehicles on the road, infrastructure like light poles, cyclists like me, pedestrians, and road workers. CV2X is also expected to support new advanced applications as we transition to faster and more responsive 5G networks. And it is backed by automakers like Ford and Audi and BMW and Daimler and Tesla. And so we're proposing to designate the upper 20 megahertz for this exciting new automotive communications technology. This would be a significant step forward for automotive safety since there is currently no spectrum allocated for CV2X. As Ford CEO James Hackett wrote to us, extensive testing has shown that CV2X will give people the ability to move more safely and freely than ever before. Without this proceeding, CV2X cannot be deployed. And we're also not closing the door on DSRC. Japan has a single 10 megahertz channel devoted to DSRC that is actively used for collision avoidance. And so in the notice, we seek comment on whether to designate the remaining 10 megahertz of spectrum in the upper part of the 5.9 gigahertz band for DSRC or CV2X. And I encourage advocates of each technology, come to the FCC and make your case. So this balanced approach, dedicating 45 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band for more unlicensed innovation and 30 megahertz for automotive safety, maximizes the band's value for the American people. And it would do far more for both automotive safety and Wi-Fi than the status quo. Now, the support for moving forward with this proposal is simply overwhelming. It includes a bipartisan juggernaut from Congress, including Senator Johnson, House Energy and Commerce Vice Chair Yvette Clarke, House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Communications and Technology Ranking Member Bob Latta, and Representatives Jerry McNerney, Anna Eshoo, G.K. Butterfield, Doris Matsui, Billy Long, Mark Walker, Tom Emmer, Brian Babin, and Andy Biggs. It also includes think tanks and consumer groups like Alvanza, American Commitment, American Conservative Union, American Legislative Exchange Council, the American Library Association, Americans for Tax Reform, Center for Individual Freedom, Citizens Against Government Waste, Competitive Enterprise Institute, Consortium for School Networking, Consumer Action for a Strong Economy, Digital Liberty, Discovery Institute, Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, Electronic Frontier Foundation, INGEN, Free State Foundation, FreedomWorks, Innovation Defense Foundation, Innovation Economy Institute, Institute for Freedom, Institute for Policy Innovation, Less Government, Lincoln Network, Market Institute, Multicultural Media Telecom and Internet Council, the National Taxpayers Union, New America's Open Technology Institute, Pelican Center for Technology and Innovation, Public Knowledge, Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council, Taxpayer Protection Alliance, Tech Freedom, and Wi-Fi Forward. Do you need more? I've got more. It includes industry groups and companies like the 5G Automotive Association, the App Association, Broadcom, Charter, Comcast, Facebook, Ford, Intel, Microsoft, the National Puerto Rican Chamber of Commerce, NCTA, Nokia, Qualcomm, Samsung, Verizon, and the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association. This is a broad and deep array of supporters who see the future and encourage the FCC to move forward into that future boldly, which is what we are doing. Thank you to the FCC staff who are working hard to ensure that this spectrum is put to its highest valued use. Of course, from the Office of Engineering Technology, led by Chief Knapp, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of General Counsel, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the International Bureau, the Enforcement Bureau, and the Wireline Competition Bureau. This was not at all easy, but we are going to continue to focus on the facts and get the job done for the American people. Thanks to the staff for the great work. With that, we'll move to a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Stark.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the great work. Madam Secretary, to item number 3 we go.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and is entitled Facilitating Shared Use in the 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band. Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And Mr. Stockdale, whenever you and your team are ready, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners.
Morning.
I am pleased to present to you the 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band notice of proposed rulemaking. Joining me at the table today are Matthew Pearl, Roger Noel, Jessica Griffinius, Paul Powell, and Mary Claire York, all of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. In addition to the staff at the table, I would like to thank the Commission staff listed on the slide for their input. Mary Claire will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. We present to you today a notice of proposed rulemaking that would take an initial step to prepare the 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band for possible expanded commercial use. Specifically, the item proposes to remove the non-federal allocations from the 3.3 to 3.55 gigahertz band. The notice also proposes to relocate incumbent non-federal operations out of the band and seeks comment on relocation options, transition mechanisms, and the related costs and benefits. Currently, the entire 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band is allocated for both federal and non-federal radio location services, with non-federal users operating on a secondary basis to federal radio location services, which have the primary allocation. On the non-federal side, the band is used for a variety of commercial and industrial radio location services, such as Doppler radar, to provide weather information to broadcast viewers. In addition to radio location services, the 3.3 to 3.5 gigahertz band is allocated for non-federal amateur use. The 3.5 to 3.55 gigahertz band is allocated for federal aeronautical radio navigation services, and the 3.1 to 3.3 gigahertz band is allocated for space research and Earth exploration satellite use. The item's proposals are consistent with the Commission's obligations under the Mobile Now Act to make available spectrum for new mobile and fixed wireless use, and to work in consultation with the National Telecommunications and Information Administration to evaluate the feasibility of allowing commercial wireless services to share use of spectrum between 3.1 and 3.55 gigahertz. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. York, and congratulations on what I believe is your first presentation at an open meeting of the FCC. Very well done.
Thank you.
We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I happily approve today's notice starting a proceeding to take the initial steps towards opening the 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band for next generation commercial wireless services. To realize the true potential of 5G, the Commission will need far more mid-band spectrum than is currently available or already in the pipeline. Unlike high and low band spectrum, the mid-bands provide the perfect combination of increased capacity and improved geographic coverage that is ideal for 5G offerings. It's why it's been my focus. It's been the focus of my spectrum efforts for the last several years. Because of the greater propagation, the mid-bands are considered a crucial input to provide 5G in less populated areas of America where there is unlikely to be a business case for dense millimeter wave deployments. Currently, we have general authorized access or unlicensed like 3.5 gigahertz spectrum available with priority access licenses to be auctioned in June and C-band scheduled to be auctioned in late 2020. While this spectrum schedule is great news, we will need even more to meet the needs of all those interested in deploying 5G or other innovative services. Accordingly, it is imperative that we find additional bandwidth, and the 3.1 to 3.5 gigahertz frequencies located adjacent to the 3.5 gigahertz band are the best candidate. This item starts the fairly benign task of moving the non-federal incumbents out of the 3.3 to 3.55 gigahertz portion of the band. And for those unfamiliar, these are the very same frequencies that other countries are targeting for 5G, with portions of the band already globally harmonized or in the process of being studied for that purpose. One positive outcome of the WRC-19 is that the international community agreed to study the 3.3 to 3.4 gigahertz band for IMT designation so that it would have the same designation as the 3.4 to 3.55 gigahertz, which is mostly harmonized. As such, I am completely supportive of this item. At the same time, when we start to relocate non-federal systems, the bigger challenge of the federal is of the federal incumbent users who still remain, which will require considerably more attention and energy. Consider that Congress identified the 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band numerous times for possible commercial wireless use and ordered NTIA to report on the feasibility of sharing this band by March 2020. By all accounts, however, they are studying only 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz. This is not what Congress required, and it's even more disappointing because the U.S. Department of Defense previously signaled years ago that it would cede this spectrum for commercial purposes before reversing course and engaging in protracted unnecessary studies. I've seen comments that DoD disputes this point, but it's been verified multiple times by reputable individuals in the know. So everyone should stop pretending otherwise. Simply put, this upper 100 megahertz of spectrum should be cleared and repurposed for commercial use immediately. As for spectrum below 3.45 gigahertz, work may still have to be completed to determine whether it can be cleared, and if clearing is not possible, then sharing the spectrum with federal incumbents must be explored. Any needed studies should be completed as soon as possible. We can't wait for years to figure out how much and where the spectrum is used, what needs to occur to relocate users, or what protection mechanisms need to be put in place. In this vein, I'm slightly disappointed that we do not take this opportunity to move non-federal users out of the lower 200 megahertz, similarly starting the process for introducing next-generation services into the 3.1 to 3.33 gigahertz. As this is ultimately our intention, it doesn't make sense to me to consider moving the current non-federal users of the upper portion of the band into the lower portion of the band when it's clear that we must either clear or share that spectrum too. But I look forward to reviewing the record as it develops and discussing this issue with interested parties. I thank the chairman for starting the process of repurposing these bands for next-generation wireless services. In particular, I appreciate his willingness to add language to the draft stating that clearing spectrum is the Commission's priority and that repurposing the 3.45 to 3.55 band should be a matter of greatest importance. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr, sorry.
Thanks. In January, I began calling 2019 the year of 5G. Now, the concept of 5G leadership in America did, in fact, go viral. My hashtag, year of 5G, sadly did not. Could have used a friendly bump from someone with 60,000 Twitter followers that might have made a difference. This year, I have another hashtag candidate, the year of 3 gigahertz. And that's because 2020 is shaping up for tremendous action in that band. Right now, starting at the top of 3 gigahertz is the C-band, where I'm focused on a 2020 public auction of that spectrum, which should be music to the ears of some. In the middle of the band, we have a 2020 auction of CBRS spectrum lined up. And here at the bottom of 3 gigahertz, we're now taking steps that could make available up to 250 megahertz of additional spectrum for advanced wireless services, including 5G. Now, this is an NPRM, so I can't promise where we'll land precisely on all the questions in 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz, much as I can't promise just how viral hashtag year of 3 gigahertz will go, but I think we know the answer to that last one. I can't promise, though, the Commission will continue our work to free up more spectrum for next-gen applications. I want to thank the Bureau for its work on the item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
This notice of proposed rulemaking is the kind of forward-looking, proactive effort we need to start freeing up valuable mid-band spectrum for next-generation 5G wireless services. In it, we recognize that our federal partners at NTIA are actively studying opportunities to make the 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band available for 5G use. But rather than sitting on our hands while that work is being done, we are here today getting a head start. We're taking steps to clean up our own house so that when the time is right, we can move quickly to repurpose some or all of this band for new uses. To this end, today's rulemaking asks questions about removing non-federal secondary allocations and relocating incumbent users. To be clear, this is the preliminary stuff, because the truth is we have a long way to go before this set of airwaves can be opened for 5G. Still, this effort is a small step in the right direction, and it has my support. But one thing is clear. When it comes to mid-band spectrum for 5G, we need to move more and move faster. That's why when this agency started a proceeding to slow down plans to bring mid-band spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band to market, I dissented. It's why when this agency passed up an opportunity to reimagine the 2.5 gigahertz band for 5G and instead opted for a messy and limited auction instead, I dissented. It's why when the agency prioritized auctioning its 3rd, 4th, and 5th millimeter wave bands this year before what could have been its very first mid-band auction, I dissented. And it's why when the agency started a rulemaking on the C-band, I suggested that if we wanted to avoid delay, we should include Congress in our work. But that too was ignored, and now we are paying for it in lost time and fresh ambiguities about our legal authority. So here's the truth. If you survey these proceedings, you will see that our spectrum policies are increasingly divorced from the realities on the ground in the United States and the priorities in the rest of the world. And this has consequences for our wireless leadership, the digital divide, and national security. And if you want evidence, you don't have to take my word for it. Earlier this year, the Defense Innovation Board, the United States military's premier advisory board of academic researchers and private sector technologists, surveyed the state of next-generation 5G networks and issued a sober warning. They found that the country that owns 5G will own innovations and sets standards for the rest of the world. And that country currently is not likely to be the United States. So why is that? It's our failure to move mid-band spectrum. As the experts on the Defense Innovation Board stated, the FCC is currently prioritizing millimeter wave over mid-band spectrum. And that is a fundamentally flawed focus. They're right. To date, the FCC has focused its early efforts to support 5G wireless service by bringing only high-band spectrum to market. The rest of the world does not share this singular early focus on high-band millimeter wave airwaves. In fact, at least 16 countries have already auctioned mid-band spectrum specifically for the provision of 5G wireless services. They include Australia, Finland, Germany, Italy, Ireland, Japan, Kuwait, Latvia, Mexico, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Spain, the United Arab Emirates, and the United Kingdom. In addition, China has allocated mid-band spectrum for 5G use and did so last year. But in the United States, we have yet to auction a single swath of mid-band spectrum. To date, we have brought exactly 0 megahertz of mid-band airwaves to market for 5G. Rather than recognize this reality, this agency has simply insisted that all bands matter and all is well. But that is clearly not the case when you look at efforts abroad or right here at home, where our carriers are chomping at the bit for mid-band airwaves. So today's effort to identify non-federal secondary allocations in one swath of mid-band airwaves has benefits. But it is not enough. Because the evidence demonstrates very clearly that for too long, the United States has been alone in its mission to make millimeter wave the center of our early 5G approach. This is a problem. It means we could find ourselves on the sidelines as mid-band spectrum becomes the core of worldwide 5G service. That means less scale, higher costs, and interoperability challenges. It also means, as I noted up front, new challenges for national security, the digital divide, and our wireless leadership. First, national security. Just over a month ago, I testified before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs that the most important step the United States can take to secure its networks in the short term is to make more mid-band spectrum available. Right now, in many of these airwaves worldwide, there is only one Chinese vendor offering equipment. That means that countries that are already building their 5G networks using mid-band spectrum do not have a competitive choice for secure equipment. But in the United States, we have unique skill and scale, and when deployment takes place here, vendors follow. And when we expand the market for secure equipment at home, it will also grow abroad. On the heels of this hearing, the bipartisan leadership of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, Intelligence, Foreign Affairs, and Armed Services wrote the White House about just this kind of problem and the lack of a national plan for 5G security. They see we need one. They're right. Second, the digital divide. Making millimeter wave spectrum the focus of our early 5G efforts is deepening the divide between rural and urban America. Recent commercial launches of 5G service in the United States using these airwaves are confirming what we already know, that commercializing millimeter wave will not be easy given its propagation challenges. The network densification these airwaves require is costly, and this makes it unsuitable for all but the most urban areas. So if we want to serve everywhere in this country and not create communities of 5G haves and have-nots, we need mid-band airwaves that provide both coverage and capacity, and we need them now. But just this week, the FCC kicked off yet another high-band spectrum auction. This one has a record-setting 3,400 megahertz of spectrum, but again, it will largely only provide coverage opportunities in urban America. So I'll say it again. There is simply no reason we should be auctioning the 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands now before a mid-band auction of the 3.5 gigahertz band. Third and finally, we are ceding international leadership when it comes to 5G. The findings of the Defense Innovation Board made clear that we chose the wrong lane in the road to 5G. We headed out with a focus on millimeter wave and got left behind by other nations that took early action on mid-band airwaves. It's time to correct course, and we need to do it with urgency. Now, I worry that we do not have that sense of urgency. That plea to the White House from the bipartisan leadership of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, Intelligence, Foreign Affairs, and Armed Services has gone unanswered. We still don't have a national plan for 5G and security. We still don't have a national spectrum strategy. Remember, this was the subject of an executive order last year, and a plan, according to this, was due back in July. And this agency still has not held an auction of mid-band spectrum for the 5G era. These are challenges, and we need to own up to them. Because if we want to secure global leadership, solve the digital divide, and secure our networks for the next generation, we have serious work to do.
Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This item is another step towards identifying new mid-band spectrum that is critical to our efforts to increase broadband access and drive 5G innovation. Mid-band spectrum combines wide-ranging coverage with low latency and large capacity and will be fundamental to providers' deployment of next-generation wireless services. As the item states, the 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band is particularly attractive because of its proximity to other bands that we in the international community have already identified for such services. We are in the midst of an era where technological innovation demands increasing amounts of spectrum, and identifying new bands that can be shared between incumbents and new uses will be critical. As we continue to open new bands to new services, I do look forward to exploring creative new policy and technical approaches that will permit the most efficient uses of our limited spectrum. Thank you to the Bureau for your hard work.
Thank you, Commissioner. In March 2018, Congress passed and the President signed the Mobile Now Act. That law aims to advance American leadership in wireless technologies in several ways. Among other things, it requires the executive branch to explore sharing of the 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band between federal operations and commercial wireless services. Currently, portions of this band are used by the Department of Defense, with some non-federal users offering services on a secondary basis. To prepare the upper portion of the 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band for the future shared use contemplated by Congress, today we are proposing to remove the existing non-federal secondary radio location and amateur allocations in the 3.3 to 3.55 band and relocate those operations to other frequencies, such as the 3.1 to 3.33 portion of the band. Today's proposal would enable continued use of the spectrum by the Department of Defense while creating a glide path for this critical mid-band spectrum to be freed up for 5G. Clearing the upper 250 megahertz of the band for existing non-federal operations would build upon the Commission's ongoing work to enable commercial use of the spectrum in nearby bands, including the 3.55 to 3.7 gigahertz band and the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band, of course commonly called the C-band. And together, these three bands would make a massive amount of prime mid-band spectrum, as much as 680 megahertz, available for new fixed and mobile wireless services. Now, our action today is just another example of our comprehensive strategy to free up spectrum for commercial use across the country and advance American leadership in 5G, the next generation of wireless connectivity. Having started from scratch when we took the reins in 2017, we have been aggressive in freeing up mid-band spectrum in particular. For instance, an auction of the 3.5 gigahertz band will commence on June 25th of 2020. The Commission is also focused on commencing an auction of 280 megahertz of spectrum in the C-band late next year. And the FCC majority recently voted to put the 2.5 gigahertz band, the largest swath of contiguous spectrum in the country, below 3 gigahertz, to use for the American people. In addition to these mid-band efforts, we've also been hard at work when it comes to high-band spectrum. In January, we finished an auction of the spectrum in the 28 gigahertz band. In May, we concluded an auction of spectrum in the 24 gigahertz band. And earlier this week, we launched an auction of 3,400 megahertz of spectrum in the upper 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands, the largest spectrum auction in American history. Now, none of these accomplishments would be possible without the efforts of our fantastic staff. And in particular, I'd like to thank the staff from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Office of Communication Business Opportunities, and the Office of General Counsel for helping us to get to this point. We appreciate the hard work. With that, we'll move to a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted. The editorial privilege is granted as requested. Thanks again. Madam Secretary, could you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fourth item is entitled Connect America Fund, Developing a Unified Intercarrier Compensation Regime. The item will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau, and Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And Ms. Monteith, whenever your folks are ready, feel free to proceed.
Just making it in the morning. So good morning again, Mr. Chairman and
Morning.
Commissioners. The Wireline Competition Bureau presents for your consideration an item that would clarify that pursuant to the Commission's Voip Symmetry rule, a local exchange carrier, or LEC, providing retail service with a voice over Internet protocol, or VoIP provider partner, may assess in-office switched access charges only if either the LEC or its VoIP partner provides a physical connection to the last-mile facilities used to serve the end user. The item was developed by the Wireline Competition Bureau with input from the Enforcement Bureau and the Office of General Counsel. I would like to thank the staff in the Bureau's Pricing Policy Division for their great work on this item. Seated with me at the table from the Wireline Competition Bureau are Lisa Hone, Deputy Bureau Chief, Gil Strobel, Chief of the Pricing Policy Division, Aaron Garza, who is unfortunately a former Deputy Division Chief in the Pricing Policy Division, and Rhonda Lean, Attorney Advisor in the Pricing Policy Division. Rhonda will now present the item.
All right.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The item before you would address a vacatur and remand from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit of the Commission's 2015 declaratory ruling regarding the Voip Symmetry rule and a related petition for declaratory ruling filed by CenturyLink. The FCC's legacy system of intercarrier compensation was intended to provide support for local networks by requiring long-distance providers to pay local telephone companies a per-minute fee for calls delivered over the so-called last-mile network to a home or business. Historically, these end-office access charges were a key element of local telephone companies' revenues, especially in rural areas with sparse populations. In 2011, mindful of the ongoing transition from legacy networks to Internet protocol networks, the Commission adopted the Voip Symmetry rule, allowing carriers to assess certain access charges on VoIP traffic where the VoIP provider or its LEC partner provided terminating access or its functional equivalent. In 2015, however, the Commission departed from its precedent in a declaratory ruling by interpreting the Voip Symmetry rule to allow a local exchange carrier and its VoIP provider partner to collect end-office switched access charges where neither the LEC nor its VoIP partner provided a physical connection to last-mile facilities. If adopted, this item would affirm that, consistent with precedent and the purpose of these charges, a VoIP-LEC partnership may collect end-office switched access charges where either the LEC or its VoIP provider partner provides access to the last-mile facilities used to serve an end user. If adopted, this item would address issues raised by the Court of Appeals remand order, deny a pending petition from CenturyLink to reaffirm the 2015 declaratory ruling, and provide carriers with certainty and predictability about the correct application of the Voip Symmetry rule, thus helping to resolve ongoing intercarrier access charge disputes. The Bureau recommends adoption of the order and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. And notwithstanding the fact that the room cleared out, I want you to know that was pretty compelling to me. So thank you for that explanation of the item. With that, we'll move to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chair, and please don't take it personally, but I'm going to submit my statement for the record.
We have the time. All right.
I got other things.
Commissioner Carr.
Thank you so much for the presentation and to the whole team for your work on the item. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
All right. I will give you the dignity of saying something. As you know, with this decision, we take up the Byzantine topic of our rules governing compensation for the exchange of network traffic, and specifically, we address the application of the so-called Voip Symmetry rule when the traffic exchange involves an over-the-top VoIP service on the terminating end of a call. Now, 4 years ago, the agency took up this very same topic and found that the Voip Symmetry rule did not require a competitive carrier or its over-the-top VoIP partner to provide a physical last-mile facility to the VoIP provider's end-user customers in order to provide the functional equivalent of end-office switching. Yeah, got that? In any event, I believe that was actually the correct call because it advanced the goal of facilitating the IP transition and reduced incentives for arbitrage. Now, in the interim, the court has spoken, and it handed our prior ruling back and urged us to try again. While I would have preferred that this agency expand its work to justify our prior decision, because I think it still has merit, I am mindful that the court left us with limited room to maneuver. Accordingly, I acknowledge that in this decision we changed course, and on that I'm going to respectfully concur.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the last decade, the FCC has taken numerous steps, including the 2011 transformation order to update its rules to support the transition to IP-based networks. And during that time, we have repeatedly recognized that many of the technical distinctions in our rules are no longer relevant and may impede the IP transition. The 2015 declaratory ruling underlying today's action was adopted to help ensure that those rules promoted and protected competition. And while I also similarly recognize that the DC's decision narrowed our policy options, I do have concerns about the approach the Commission takes today and will similarly concur. Today's decision purports to advance competition in the voice services market, but it is more likely to deter competition by disadvantaging over-the-top VoIP providers. And in many recent decisions, the Commission has proceeded as if our work to promote competition is done, and the facts on the ground make clear to me that that's not true. We must continue to support competitive choices that promote better service and lower prices for Americans. Thank you to the Bureau for the hard work, though.
Thank you, Commissioner. We have a very tangled web of regulations known as intercarrier compensation, and one of those regulations permits the local phone company to charge a long-distance carrier for terminating a long-distance call to a customer on the local carrier's network. Now, in 2011, the Commission adopted a rule to put increasingly popular VoIP providers on equal footing with traditional providers by allowing them to collect those charges if they are performing the same function. In 2015, the Commission, in a party line vote and over my dissent, tried to expand the interpretation of that rule to cover all VoIP providers so that even those who were not actually providing the physical connection or doing the work of switching a call would get compensated nonetheless. Shortly after, as we have heard, the D.C. Circuit overturned the prior commission's order. And so today we address the court's concerns and bring our interpretation of the 2011 rule back in line with years of commission and telecommunications industry practice. This might seem like an arcane and weedy matter, and it is, but it is also important because by limiting intercarrier compensation charges to companies that are actually providing a physical connection, we ensure that our rules provide an incentive to build out networks and to continue the transition from traditional copper-based networks to modern IP-based networks. And that'll support continued future innovation and digital opportunity for American consumers. And so for the great work that our expert staff contributed to this item, I would like to thank the staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Enforcement Bureau, and the Office of General Counsel. And with that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Concur.
Commissioner Starks.
Concur.
And the chair votes to approve. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And with that, Madam Secretary, we'll go to item number 5, I believe, on today's agenda.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the 5th item on your agenda will be presented by the Media Bureau and is entitled Cable Service Change Notifications, Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative, Amendment of the Commission's Rules related to Retransmission Consent. Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
All right. Thank you, Madam Secretary. And Ms. Carey, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today, the Media Bureau presents its 19th Notice of Proposed Rulemaking as part of the Commission's Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative. This item seeks to reduce the potential for consumer confusion by inviting comment on whether to update the Commission's rules concerning notices that cable operators must provide in the context of retransmission consent and program carriage negotiations. Joining me at the table are Brendan Murray, Maria Malarkey, and John Cobb. John will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we are pleased to present this notice of proposed rulemaking that seeks to revise the Commission's rules regarding notices that cable operators provide to subscribers and local franchise authorities regarding service or rate changes. In today's video marketplace, retransmission consent and program carriage negotiations are often concluded within days, if not hours, of the expiration of existing agreements. And in those cases, it is frequently unclear, 30 days prior to the contract's expiration, whether a new agreement will be reached, there will be a short-term extension, or programming will be dropped. However, the Commission's rules require cable operators to provide notice of all service, rate, and channel lineup changes to subscribers and LFAs 30 days in advance of the change. This poses unique challenges for cable operators and difficult questions regarding what notice cable operators should be required to provide to subscribers and when they should be required to provide it. On the one hand, subscribers must receive meaningful information regarding their programming options so they can make informed decisions about their service. On the other hand, numerous inaccurate or premature notices about theoretical programming disruptions that never come to pass can cause consumer confusion, lead subscribers to change providers unnecessarily, and distract consumers from notices about actual channel deletions. The NPRM invites comment on several changes to the rules to make consumer notices more meaningful and accurate, reduce consumer confusion, and ensure that subscribers receive the information they need to make informed choices about their service options. Specifically, the NPRM seeks comment on 3 issues. First, whether the Commission should amend sections 76.1601 and 76.1603 of its rules to make clear that cable operators must provide subscriber notice as soon as possible when service changes occur due to retransmission consent or program carriage negotiations that fail within the last 30 days of a contract. Second, whether the Commission should modify section 76.1603C to require service and rate change notices to LFAs only if required by an LFA pursuant to its statutory authority. And finally, whether the Commission should adopt several technical edits to sections 76.1601 and 76.1603 to make the rules more readable and remove duplicative requirements. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cobb, for your presentation. We'll now turn to any comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As is our great monthly custom for the Commission, we consider another important way to update our media regulations by acknowledging the reality that retransmission consent negotiations often continue well within the 30-day window contemplated by our existing rules at issue. Specifically, this item proposes to rightfully remove an FCC mandate for traditional video providers that doesn't match up with real-world practices. Appropriately, the item takes care to ask numerous questions about consumer costs and benefits as well, to ensure that we do not take steps that would confuse consumers or require certain businesses to make announcements about hypothetical outcomes prematurely. I recognize that in the retrans arena, even the slightest changes can have an impact on the bargaining power of one entity or another, so we proceed judiciously. At the same time, these debates continually highlight the need for wholesale reform. If we confine every debate to the existing regulatory silos, we can easily miss the bigger picture, which reveals the existential threat that traditional broadcasters and multi-channel video programming distributors alike face from virtually unregulated, over-the-top and streaming video providers. This, of course, does not mean we should neglect our effort to reform existing regulations. Quite the contrary. We should boldly advance more aggressive reforms in this arena to allow additional providers and traditional providers to move more effectively with the rest of the marketplace. And I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Mind the gap. Cross traffic does not stop. Beware of dog. There's no doubt that notice can be a good thing. It helps us stay safe in unfamiliar circumstances and to make informed choices about our day-to-day lives. But not all notice is created equal. To be truly meaningful, notice must be relevant, timely, and actionable, and most of all, accurate. If our subscriber notice requirements for cable service changes are not providing customers with meaningful information, then the notices may be doing more harm than good. And there's every indication that this might be the case. For instance, our rules require cable providers to notify their customers 30 days before a channel goes dark, provided the change is within their control. But here's the catch, a catch 76.1603, if you will, and if you're still awake. In carriage negotiations, no single party controls the outcome. As a practical matter, it's not always clear when a provider hits that 30-day mark. After all, retrans, consent, and program carriage disputes are often resolved within the 30-day window before an agreement expires, and both sides seem to agree that carriage disputes are exceedingly rare. So it would be odd for the FCC's rules to require providers to send notices when there's no indication that negotiations have broken down. And that notice would not appear to advance the interest of consumers either. Therefore, we ask the right questions today about ways we can create a more effective notice regime. And I want to thank the Media Bureau for its work on the item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
You know, few Americans have ever heard the term retransmission consent. It is one of those wonky and lawyerly things we bandy about in these halls and in this town. Fewer still know that about a quarter of a century ago, Congress prohibited retransmitting a broadcast television station signal without the station owner's consent, and at the same time, directed parties negotiating for this consent to do so in good faith. But far too many Americans know what happens when those retransmission consent negotiations go wrong. They turn on the screen, hoping to watch the news, their favorite show, or the big game, and instead are stuck with a dark screen. They may not know how and why retransmission consent negotiations between broadcasters and their cable or satellite company have failed, but they know a blackout means they are not getting the programming they paid for. The FCC has long had rules to govern these negotiations, and when those negotiations fail, our rules require cable providers to give their subscribers notice of a possible change in service 30 days in advance. The purpose behind this rule is clear. We want consumers to have advance notice of any disruption in service. But we also need to ensure that this rule works in the real world. And right now, our approach is absolute. So it requires alerting subscribers to ongoing negotiations that often get resolved in the final week, days, or hours of a retransmission consent carriage contract, and never actually lead to a dark screen. So with the media marketplace evolving, it makes sense to take a fresh look at these rules. But I think when we do so, we need to ensure that consumers come first. Let's not forget that their voices need to be heard too, because they are the ones paying for this service. And to this end, I want to thank my colleagues for making some changes to today's decision, including removing what I thought were heavy-handed and anti-consumer tentative conclusions, and also for their willingness to include additional questions at the request of my colleague, Commissioner Starks. I look forward to the record that develops.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief among our responsibilities at the Commission is protecting consumers. This is a responsibility that I take very seriously. The FCC at its best is an important referee on the field, making sure that consumers receive the services that they pay for, aren't charged services that they don't want, and aren't otherwise taken advantage of in the marketplace. Consumers are currently facing a challenging video marketplace, with television blackouts becoming more frequent, lasting longer, higher bills, and increasing fees. Indeed, this year, consumers across the country have experienced 276 television blackouts, up from only 8 in 2010, with the very longest blackout lasting 3/4 of a year. And according to Consumer Reports, cable customers now pay an average of 13 line-item fees on each bill, amounting to $450 on top of the cost of the service itself. In this complex and evolving environment, I firmly believe that transparency is the key, and regulatees should communicate early and often with customers about any changes to their rates or services. And that's why I did approach today's proceeding with some caution. This NPRM proposes to amend our statutorily mandated cable consumer protection rules in a way that I was concerned could result in less information being shared with consumers, and more unwelcome surprises in the form of blacked out channels and lost service. Indeed, under the proposed rules, it's possible that for the first time a cable subscriber finds out that her very favorite channel has gone dark, and the moment that will be that she realizes that is when she turns it on to watch that show or that event or that live showing. This impacts consumers' pocketbooks, jeopardizes access to services that they pay for, and at the end of the day is just plain frustrating. With that in mind, I requested additional questions be teed up in this item to further explore whether these proposals will work as intended, or whether they could lead to undue and unintended harm to consumers. Specifically, I asked about consumer harms that could stem from a practice of providing notice to consumers for the first time after a blackout has already begun, and in my mind, such a practice runs the real risk of resulting in consumers paying for services that they haven't received and depriving them of a real opportunity to mitigate any service disruptions. I also asked whether there are factors that impact a consumer's ability to change providers in the event of a loss of programming. Often consumers are locked away and locked into contracts with hefty early termination fees that make it more difficult to switch providers in the face of an impending and ongoing blackout. I also sought questions about other ways to provide notice to consumers, whether it would be preferable to provide notice closer to the time that a channel is lost, and whether such notices should be included in cable operators' public files. I do appreciate the willingness of the chairman and my colleagues to add these questions to the item. I hope that answers to these questions will result in a robust record, and for that reason, I will vote to approve this NPRM, and will certainly review the resulting record closely to make sure that our ultimate action here does put consumers front and center. I appreciate the work of the media staff on this item.
Thank you, Commissioner. I will have a longer statement for the record, but for now, let me simply say that most contentious retransmission consent and program carriage disputes between broadcasters and cable programmers on one hand and cable operators on the other are resolved shortly before existing agreements expire, sometimes just hours before they expire. But our rules simply don't reflect this marketplace reality. They require, as we have heard, at least 30 days notice of a channel deletion, if that deletion is within the control of the cable operator. And the Commission many years ago suggested that blackouts that result from failed retransmission consent or program carriage negotiations are within the control of a cable operator. But it doesn't make sense for the FCC to require cable operators to send out a notice that programming will be dropped whenever carriage negotiations carry into the last 30 days of a contract. And that's because, as mentioned, the vast majority of these potential channel deletions never come to pass, as the impasse is resolved within that 30-day period. And so these notices mainly serve to confuse consumers and to desensitize them to notice of channel deletions that are, in fact, actually going to occur. So the notice of proposed rulemaking we adopt today proposes to make our notification requirements more meaningful and accurate for consumers by requiring them to be sent as soon as possible after retransmission consent or program carriage negotiations have failed and a channel deletion is in the cards. In my view, this change would reduce consumer confusion and give subscribers the information they need to make informed choices about their service options. This item also proposes revisions to other rules to eliminate redundancies and to make some technical tweaks to make our rules a bit more readable. Anyone who's enjoyed the simple pleasure of reading Part 76 by the fireplace during the holiday blizzard know that some of these rules are not exactly models of clarity. So for the work on this fantastic item, I'd like to thank the lean and mean staff of the Commission that worked on this item, from the Media Bureau, Michelle Carey, John Cobb, Brendan Murray, and Sarah Weitzel. And from the Office of General Counsel, Susan Arid and David Consul. This item has my full support. And Maria Malarkey, sorry, it was listed there as well. So I just skipped it over. With that, we'll move to a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks so much. And Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next items on the agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, last on your agenda, items 6, 7, and 8 are enforcement actions for your consideration. The items will be presented by the Enforcement Bureau. Rosemary Harrell, Chief of the Bureau, will introduce the items.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And because these are enforcement-related matters, we are going to switch up the order just slightly, as we traditionally do, in cases that involve the presentation of a notice of apparent liability for forfeiture, or NAL, at an open meeting. As with all open meeting items, the Bureau circulated these items to every commissioner 3 weeks ago. But there's a longstanding practice at the agency that we don't publicly disclose the target of an investigation unless and until the Commission decides through a formal vote to take enforcement action. And so for these items, this means that the agency will formally vote on the item, then hear a brief presentation from the Bureau, and then proceed to any statements that commissioners may have. This process ensures that the target will not be publicly disclosed until after the FCC has voted to take action. We're going to follow that precedent here, so we will now proceed directly to vote on the items. Item 6 on the agenda, Class 190131. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted, as I anticipate might be requested. Item number 7 on the agenda, Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
Chair votes to approve as well. Yada, yada, yada. Item number 8 on the agenda, Commissioner O'Reilly.
Yeah, aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. Usual disclaimer. Okay. Now, Ms. Harold, if you could please proceed with introducing items 6 and 7 together on today's agenda.
Happy to do that, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to all of the commissioners, and thank you for your consideration and your votes on the 2 notices of apparent liability for forfeiture that address apparent violations of the Communications Act by pirate broadcasters. With me at the table are Jeremy Marcus, Associate Bureau Chief, and Senior Field Counsel Matt Gibson. Also present in the room are agents from our Boston field office whose tireless work and investigative skill made these items possible. I would also like to thank Chris Killian, Deputy Bureau Chief, Ron Ramage, Acting Field Director, Janet Moran, Deputy Field Director, Dave Dombrowski, Region 2 Regional Director, and Shannon Lipp, our legal advisor in the front office, for their work on these investigations, as well as the Office of General Counsel for its invaluable support. Matt will now present both items.
Thank you, Rosemary. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good afternoon.
Unlicensed radio stations, also known as pirate radio stations, operate illegally undermine the Commission's efforts to manage limited radio spectrum and can interfere with licensed communications, including authorized broadcast and public safety transmissions. Some of the most egregious pirate operations persist for many years, even after the Enforcement Bureau notifies the operators that their conduct is illegal. These cases merit the strongest possible enforcement measures. The first item is a Notice of Apparent Liability for Forfeiture, or NAL, against Asserom Jean Charles for operating his pirate broadcast station, Radio Concord, in apparent violation of Section 301 of the Communications Act. This item proposes a penalty of $151,005, the maximum amount permitted under the Communications Act, against Jean Charles for his apparent operation of a single illegal broadcast transmitter in the Mattapan neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts. The Enforcement Bureau received multiple complaints from Boston area residents alleging that an enterprise calling itself Radio Concord was operating illegally on 106.3 megahertz in the Mattapan neighborhood. Enforcement Bureau agents investigated the complaints, identifying the specific location from which Radio Concord was operating and confirming that the transmitter was operating in a manner that requires a license from the Commission. The Enforcement Bureau provided Jean Charles with written notices that the operation of Radio Concord was illegal and must cease. On July 16, 2019, an agent from the Enforcement Bureau's Boston field office confirmed that the unlawful broadcasts nonetheless continued. Given the Enforcement Bureau's repeated warnings, coupled with the station's continuous operations, this item proposes a penalty of $151,005 for the apparent continuing violation of Section 301 of the Communications Act. The second item is an NAL proposing an aggregate penalty of $453,015 against Gerlin Caesar for operating 3 distinct illegal broadcast transmitters in apparent violation of Section 301 of the Communications Act. The item's proposed penalty represents the maximum amount permitted for 3 apparent continuing violations of Section 301 of the Act. The Enforcement Bureau received multiple complaints from Boston area residents alleging that Gerlin Caesar was operating a station called Radio Teleboston on both 90.1 megahertz and 92.1 megahertz from multiple locations in and around Boston, Massachusetts. Enforcement Bureau agents investigated the complaints, identifying the specific locations from which Radio Teleboston was operating and confirming that each transmitter was operating in a manner that requires a license from the Commission. The Enforcement Bureau provided Caesar with written notices that the operation of Radio Teleboston was illegal and must immediately cease. On July 16th and 17th, 2019, an agent from the Enforcement Bureau's Boston field office confirmed that the unlawful broadcasts at the 3 transmitter sites nonetheless continued. Applying the same forfeiture methodology used in the Jean Charles NAL, this item proposes a penalty of $151,005 for each of the 3 locations. This is the statutory maximum amount for a continuing violation. With 3 illegal transmitters, this item's aggregate proposed penalty is $453,015. By proposing the maximum fine permissible under the Communications Act, these items send a strong signal that the Commission will not tolerate unlicensed radio operations. The Enforcement Bureau supports the Commission's adoption of these 2 items and thanks it for editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits to each item. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson, for that presentation. We'll now turn to comments from any of the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Traditionally, I tend to avoid statements on NALs, but this issue is close to my heart and worthy of a few comments. During my tenure at the FCC, I've had the pleasure of spending time with members of our field offices on multiple occasions, and I can say with great appreciation that these dedicated and hardworking colleagues are fully committed to enforcing our regulations on the front lines. For those joining us today, I want to say thank you for all your hard work and effort. Along with the wide variety of interference and public safety investigations, the plague of pirate radio operations continues to persist for the FCC field offices overseeing certain radio markets. Yet the staff members relentlessly pursue these rogue illegal actors. It is incumbent upon the Commission to support our field staff by doing our part to make headway on this problem, and we help to do so with these actions. Today, we consider 2 NALs affecting the greater Boston radio market and have been several years in the making. Yes, several years in the making. I hope it's a sign of further action to come and certainly should represent a heightened sense of urgency within the Enforcement Bureau and the Office of General Counsel regarding this significant problem. As the chairman knows well, pirates not only harm legitimate broadcasters and their listeners in multiple ways, but also put their own audience at risk by failing to broadcast any emergency alerts or abide by consumer protection regulations. The cases we consider today demonstrate the shameless level of disregard for the law that many pirates embody. While we may never see $1 from these illegal operations under the forfeiture items, if we go to that far, our goal should be to use enforcement authority to help shut down the perpetrators, those aiding and abetting, and any landlord willing to house such activities. These cases also demonstrate some of the challenges that confront the Commission in pursuing pirates beyond the time and cost it takes to build a case against them. For one, the cap on liability severely limits our ability to take action against these outlaw broadcasts. Compare the proposed assessed forfeitures in these pirate radio cases, which are in the thousands, as Mr. Gibson pointed out, to the multi-million-dollar proposed assessment in another enforcement action we will consider later. Perhaps the Commission can consider taking a broader view of what constitutes a single act or failure to act, as we have in the past in other instances. Is there a way to treat a pirate radio station that only operates on the weekends as a perpetrator of multiple separate illegal acts? In the meantime, I will continue to work with interested members of the House and Senate to complete passage of new legislation that will directly aid the Commission and its field staff in pursuit of these scofflaws. In addition to increasing the amount of forfeitures, which would help attract the attention of the Department of Justice in collecting fines and prosecuting these cases, it would well be worth the effort to pursue options to speed up the enforcement process. Once identified, cases materializing to the NAL stage seem to drag on a little bit too long. Increasing DC staff resources could be one way to expedite the process. I can tell you from firsthand observation that many pirate operators are relatively well known in their communities, and that our field staff do a tremendous job investigating these cases and keeping tabs on those breaking the law. Yet the number of illegal operators seems to remain constant. As we continue to pursue the creation of additional tools, I'm very pleased to see us move forward today and act on two well-known perpetrators in Boston. I applaud the Bureau staff, the field agents, and I will vote to approve. I guess I already did. So I thank the chair.
Too late now. Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Good.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Special thank you to our field offices for this investigation and all the work you do every day.
And Commissioner Starks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a former enforcement official, both at the FCC and the Department of Justice, it should come as no surprise to anybody that I strongly support today's actions and the investigative work performed by EB's field agents that went into it. The FCC exists in part to manage the use of spectrum, and at its inception was created to prevent interference among broadcast signals. Let there be no doubt that when we act to enforce the law preventing unlicensed stations, we are executing a statutorily mandated duty that protects licensed and public safety operations and ensures that folks using our airwaves are bound by our rules concerning emergency alerting, indecency, payola, political advertising, transparency, and more. That said, it is impossible for me to consider today's actions without experiencing the disheartening realization that something is not fully working as it should. There are no excuses for those who choose to break the law and violate our rules, full stop. But I cannot help but think about what impact the Commission's long-standing abdication of our diversity obligations has had on the development of the unlicensed stations serving immigrant communities. Our numbers reveal that representatives of the communities that largely turn to pirate radio, Haitians, Jamaicans, Trinidadians, folks from Grenada, Guyana, to name just a few, are absent from the rank of our licensed operations. Opportunities to obtain licenses are few and far between, and even when they do open up, opportunities remain severely limited in the highly urban populated centers like New York, Boston, Miami, where we find these unlicensed operators. Where would we be today if we had provided real opportunities for these operators years ago and were more intentional about making our licenses evenly distributed with diversity obligations in mind? What if we had listened to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals the first time, the second time, the third time when it issued one of its Prometheus opinions, telling us that we need to better study how our rules and policies impact ownership opportunities for women and people of color. And what if we had acted years ago to put in place solid, legally sound programs to promote ownership diversity? On this fourth remand from the Prometheus Court, I have called for the FCC to improve our data and conduct new empirical research to support targeted efforts to improve broadcast ownership and diversity. Our work here is long overdue. According to one local business owner who routinely tunes into one of the unlicensed stations at issue today, the most important way of communication that we have is the radio. Haitian radio is very, very, very important in our community. If all these stations get shut down, the Haitian community will shut down too. These operators took matters into their own hands by broadcasting without a license, which risks other licensees and public safety in clear violation of the law. They cannot be allowed to serve their communities illegally in this way. But I also believe that we must widen our aperture on today's action to fully capture how the FCC's policies have also let these communities down. Both are true, and we can do better. As I've noted throughout my statement, I fully support our efforts and appreciate the tireless work of the Enforcement Bureau and our field agents. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I will have a fuller statement for the record, but for now I will simply say that I think Commissioner O'Reilly, who has long led the charge on this issue, has explained very well why this issue matters and what the FCC is doing to address the issue. I will simply point out, in addition to that there are many legal alternatives to unlicensed broadcasting. In 2013, we held a successful filing window for low-power FM or LPFM construction permits. And as a result of that window, nearly 1,400 news stations catering to diverse local interests have been licensed. Next year, we will hold an auction of construction permits for 130 vacant FM allotments. And just this week, we adopted a report and order that fine-tunes our non-commercial educational and LPFM point systems, which paves the way for filing windows for construction permits for those services. Those particularly eager to get on the air have other legal avenues, such as collaborating with existing stations. Indeed, one of those newly licensed LPFM stations, WCALP, Boston, Massachusetts, is a community radio station that allows residents to apply for time on the air. And finally, of course, internet streaming has become a very popular and accessible platform for distributing audio programming without an FM license. So at the end of the day, we can have the best of both worlds, the rule of law and diverse programming on the air. So my thanks to Commissioner O'Reilly for, again, advocating on this issue, and to the Commission staff that prepared these two items. From the Enforcement Bureau, Dave Dombrowski, Matt Gibson, Rosemary Harold, Chris Killian, Shannon Lipp, Jeremy Marcus, Janet Moran, and Ron Ramage. And from the Office of General Counsel, Susan Aaron, David Consul, Linda Oliver, Bill Richardson, and Royce Sherlock. I'd like to give a special thanks to our dedicated Enforcement Bureau field agents that put in the work necessary to make these NALs possible. The work of going after illegal broadcasting is time-consuming, and it also can be dangerous. You face harassment and even threats in your line of work, as I heard personally during a visit to the Miami field office not long ago. But your efforts are certainly appreciated by those of us here at the Commission. And with the indulgence of my colleagues, would the folks from the Boston field office who happen to be here stand? We so rarely get the chance to recognize you for the work you do, and it'd be great to do that here at the FCC's headquarters if you are around.
Wave.
Anybody?
You guys can wave at least.
Feel free to stand up and get the credit you deserve if you're. Are they around? Yeah. Appreciate it.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, we were trying to balance the desire to keep our agent's identity undercover with the understandable desire to give them a round of applause. It ended up turning out fine. So thank you.
It's all my instinct. So sorry about that. I apologize for that. Very much apologize for that. Now we have that, and the Patriots lost to the Chiefs for them to savor. So sorry about that. We go to item number 8, Ms. Harold.
Good afternoon again, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, and thank you again for your consideration and your votes on today's final EB item, a notice of apparent liability for forfeiture addressing apparent violations of the law and the Commission's rules by a robocaller who spoofed the phone number of a business competitor to make thousands of unlawful robocalls. With me at the table are Lisa Gelb, Deputy Bureau Chief and Chief of Staff, and Christy Thompson, Chief of the Telecommunications Consumers Division. I'd also like to thank Shana Yates, Assistant Division Chief, Sonia Rifkin, Attorney Advisor, and Shannon Lipp, our front office legal advisor, for their work on these investigations, as well as the Office of General Counsel for its support. Christy will now present the item.
Thank you, Rosemary. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This Notice of Apparent Liability, or NAL, proposes a penalty in the amount of $9,997,750 against Kenneth Moser. He operated a telemarketing enterprise under the name Marketing Support Systems and apparently bombarded the voting public in San Diego County with thousands of spoofed robocalls during a 2-day blitz, in apparent violation of the Truth in Caller ID Act codified in Section 227 of the Act. On May 30th and 31st, 2018, potential voters in California's 76th State Assembly District received calls graphically describing an alleged sexual assault involving one of 8 candidates for the open California Assembly seat. However, shortly before that calling campaign commenced, the San Diego County Sheriff's Department had publicly announced that the allegations were baseless. Through its investigation, the Bureau determined that Moser placed these calls and that each of the 47,610 robocalls included inaccurate caller ID information. The caller ID showed the telephone number of Moser's competitor, a company called Homitel Incorporated, against which Moser has brought several lawsuits for allegedly making illegal robocalls. The evidence shows that Moser's apparent purpose in spoofing the caller ID was to harm, defraud, or otherwise wrongfully obtain something of value. Moser intended to harm both Homitel and consumers. Because Moser spoofed Homitel's phone number and did not include any accurate identifying information about the caller, Homitel received numerous complaints from irate recipients of the calls, and the disparaged candidate sent Homitel a cease and desist letter. Moser's failure to include the requisite call identification information also harmed consumers by depriving them of their ability to demand that the calls cease. Moser has brought more than a dozen lawsuits against other robocallers, including Homitel, alleging that such calls caused him significant harm. It belies belief that Moser did not know that his calls would similarly cause harm. The evidence shows that Moser was paid to make these illegal robocalls and that he had an intent to hide his identity and evade law enforcement and potential private actions for robocalls. These facts evince that Moser apparently intended to wrongfully obtain something of value by spoofing the caller ID. The Bureau plans to release contemporaneously a citation against Kenneth Moser and Marketing Support Systems for making illegal robocalls in violation of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. For the reasons I've described and as stated with additional detail in the NAL, the Enforcement Bureau supports the Commission's adoption of this item, and we request editorial privileges.
Which you've already granted, so thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson and Ms. Harold, for that presentation. We'll turn to any comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Riley.
Some very unique circumstances in this case, I must admit, but no statement from me. Thank you.
Commissioner Carr?
No statement from me here, other than going back to the prior 2 statements to offer my additional thanks to the field office staff that is here and works on these and other issues. So thank you to them.
Thank you. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
So the phone rings, and on the line is often someone offering a fabulous cruise or a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity, or maybe it's that agent from the Internal Revenue Service with the threatening news of an imminent lawsuit. They're robocalls, and they are totally out of control. At the start of this administration, consumers receive roughly 2 billion robocalls a month. They now average between 5 and 6 billion calls a month. That's crazy. Whatever we're doing now to stem the tide of these calls is simply not working. The numbers show with perfect clarity we need to do more. And it's against this background that today the FCC seeks to enforce its rules and help stop the deluge of robocalls. And in the instant decision, we have a particularly ugly set of facts. Kenneth Moser was a telemarketer who launched an extensive robocalling campaign, and it spoofed the number of his business rival and sent out calls featuring allegations of sexual assault involving a political candidate. So in response, we propose a $9.99 million fine to penalize him for this robocalling because it violates the law. This is good because enforcement of our rules designed to prevent robocalls matters. But it's not enough, because everyone should save the accolades for when we crush these calls and collect. And on that score, we have work to do. Earlier this year, the Wall Street Journal found that over $208 million in fines this agency has assessed on those responsible for robocalls. Out of that $208 million of proposed fines, we have collected, wait for it, the grand sum of $6,790. That's embarrassing. In fact, it's gotten so bad that Congress has stepped in with legislative efforts to improve coordination across the government and make it possible for this agency to collect on its enforcement fines. We need it, because without it, our action today is not especially meaningful. And let's be honest, will not stop these nuisance calls from continuing to grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit a longer statement for the record, but pleased that we are imposing a stiff penalty in this case. Mr. Moser's actions harm both the company whose number he spoofed and thousands of people who received this distressing and factually baseless message. So I deeply appreciate the work of the staff. Just an additional note that, we need a multi-pronged approach to rebuilding trust in our phone system. And as a former enforcement official, I believe vigorous enforcement has got to be part of that plan. And so I'm very supportive of today's action. Also eager to see the passage of the Pallone-Thune Traced Act that I think will provide new tools, including extending the statute of limitations that will enhance the Commission's abilities to track down illegal robocallers, stop them, and hold folks accountable. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I, too, will have a longer statement for the record, but I'll simply say for now that this notice of apparent liability is the latest, but certainly not the last, of our enforcement efforts to aggressively combat illegal robocalls and protect American consumers. This action is a great example of the FCC staff's persistence to tracking down and bringing illegal robocallers to justice. And in this regard, we are not alone. Thanks to the leadership of Senators John Thune and Ed Markey and Representatives Frank Pallone and Greg Walden, it looks like additional help is on the way. Their new bill, which already has passed the House, would make a number of reforms, one of which would extend the statute of limitations, which would make it easier for our dedicated Enforcement Bureau staff to bring some of these folks to justice. We are also working with our international partners to combat spoofed robocalls. Just this week, I held the first official cross-border call using the Shake and Stir caller ID authentication framework with Mr. Ian Scott, who is the chairperson and CEO of the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission. The implementation of Shake and Stir here in the United States will be a critical step to protect consumers from spoofed robocalls, and we will continue to work domestically and internationally on this important issue. Speaking of which, the end-of-the-year deadline for major carriers to implement Shake and Stir is coming up. I've already directed staff to review the record and to draft options for mandating the implementation of Shake and Stir by rule. And if industry does not get the job done, I will not hesitate to call for a vote by the FCC commissioners on new rules. I want to thank the staff of the Enforcement Bureau and the Office of General Counsel for their tireless efforts to rein in what Senator Hollings once called the scourge of civilization and to protect American consumers. Having already voted on the items, I won't call for a vote, but I would ask if any of my colleagues would like to make any announcements at this time.
Yes, a brief announcement, Mr. Chairman. Yes. Briefly, I'd like to thank my fall class of interns who came and helped me out this semester. Brendan Hanley, Rachel Weir. She's taking exams today at Georgetown. Good luck. They've done an outstanding job this semester. The entire team and I are grateful for all your hard work, and which went well beyond what anybody would think is expected of traditional interns in their jobs. And I hope the semester's been a great learning experience and wish you each the best. Also pleased to announce that my legal fellow, Taylor Lamb, will be staying one semester more. Thank you.
Terrific. So having started the tradition of recognizing staff that is retiring or otherwise departing the commission, December is always a difficult month for me and for us because it is the time when many employees choose to leave. And so unfortunately, I'll be a little bit longer in this presentation than I typically am, but we have a number of great folks who are leaving, and I wanted to make sure that they got recognized. And I'll go by alphabetical order by bureau, starting with the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, where Nancy Stevenson, I don't know if she is here, but, there's Nancy, all right. Nancy is retiring after 25 years at the Commission. She's a deputy chief of the CGB's Consumer Policy Division, and she's an expert, apropos to what we've just been discussing, on consumer-friendly initiatives like anti-slamming and truth in billing policies, and she led teams that produced orders to protect consumers from billing scams. She's also very effectively managed CGB's huge FOIA workload. I understand she's going to be retiring to a relaxing life in rural Pennsylvania. I mean, who needs Florida or California when you've got rural PA in January? So very much look forward to a relaxing retirement for you, Ms. Stevenson. From the Media Bureau, Martha Heller is the head of our policy division. She is leaving after feel free to, you can stay standing up if you want. No, no peer pressure. She started in 2011, and as folks who watch these proceedings know, she has done a lot of great work on media modernization across the entire spectrum, so to speak, of the issues that the Media Bureau handles. She's been a fantastic co-worker and a very smart lawyer. We wish her well in the private sector in her next engagement. Also from the Media Bureau, John Enoch, an industry analyst in the video division, is retiring after 42 years, 48 total in federal service. There you are. Yeah. I recognize John, of course, at the FCBA Chairman's Dinner in a photo that was taken by his sister, Ann Morgan, who herself is marking 46 years of service at the Commission this month. Ron Gracer, a management analysis in the video division, is retiring after 19 years. I don't know if Ron is here. Hossein Hashemzadeh, the deputy division chief of the video division, is retiring after 37 years. Had a terrific ceremony for him, and it was amazing how many people came from the outside and reflected all of the decades of his great service. Tanya Nguyen, an electronics engineer in the video division, is retiring after 32 years. And from the engineering division, Chief John Wong is retiring after 42 years. So combined, just the media folks I've discussed alone have 180 years of service at the Commission spent on television and cable licensing and policy. That young whippersnapper, Martha, drives the average down, but nonetheless, we recognize them for their service. All right, I'm not going to lie. The next one just stinks. Office of Engineering Technology. Julie Knapp, the bell has rung. Now, I've already said a ton about Julie. I put it out in a statement, chairman's tweets, you name it. But what I have not said yet is something that he said on January 7th of 2010. Why does that date matter? This is what he said on that day. In an era when technology seemed to come and go overnight, it is fitting that we recognize the astounding success and staying power of the NTSC analog TV standard that served the nation so well for more than half a century. Why on earth would I mention this? It is because, ladies and gentlemen, you are in the presence not of the chief of our Office of Engineering and Technology so much as a Hollywood star. Because it was on that date that Julie made that statement in recognition of the fact, and you might not know this, I didn't know it till yesterday, that the FCC has won an Emmy. Back in 2009, this is true. They gave us an award for technical merit, and Julie, as the chief of our engineering division, got the God, this thing is heavy. Got to hold the award, and this is it. Yeah, so. So because of the work he and others did following the transition from analog to digital TV, the FCC staff got this award. And I don't know where I guess we'll keep it by the telegraph machines out in the back. But it is cool to know, however, that Julie's work has been recognized by the wider world. But in all seriousness, Julie, you have been a fantastic member of the staff. And as I think I mentioned internally, one does not know until one gets this position how amazing your service is, your ability to distill extremely complex technical issues into a language that I can understand, your willingness behind the scenes to do the really important and difficult and sometimes politically treacherous lifting on spectrum issues, and you know what I'm talking about, is very much appreciated. And we wish you the very best after your retirement on January 3rd. We're going to keep you busy until 12:59 that or 11:59 that night. But I do want to also recognize that you're going to be succeeded by somebody who is very talented in his own right. Mr. Ron Rapazzi is the acting chief of OET. I've had the privilege of working with Ron all the way back to my time in OGC back in 2007. And Julie, we know that you're leaving the reins to somebody who's very, very capable. But Godspeed and all the best. From the Office of General Counsel, I recognized the Chairman Senator again, Gray Pash, but I do want to recognize him here. And he passed away recently after 48 years working in the Office of General Counsel. Came to work at the FCC in May 1971, straight out of the University of Kentucky Law School after being hired by the General Counsel at the time, Dick Wiley. Spent his entire career as a staff attorney in the FCC's litigation division. First case he briefed and won, December 1974. Last case he briefed was earlier this year, and he won that case too after his passing this past Tuesday when the DC Circuit rendered a decision in our favor. And we certainly hope he and his family rest in peace. Joanne Wall is leaving the Office of General Counsel. I don't know if Joanne is here. I don't see her, but she has served as an attorney at the Commission for 29 years. She spent most of her commission career in OGC's Administrative Law Division, which is how I had the chance to work with her when I was Deputy GC there. And she also had stints in the Common Carrier Bureau and the International Bureau. We recognize and appreciate her many contributions to the Commission, as well as her keen insights on the best movies and plays, which is something that I took very seriously when I was in ad law. Frank Insera is also leaving OGC. He served in the federal government for over 30 years, including 2 separate stints here at the FCC in OGC's Administrative Law Division. During his time here at the Commission, he's been a valued and trusted advisor to many folks across the Commission on matters ranging from procurement and fiscal law to the best places to eat and visit in a given city in the world, fulfilling the role that John Giusti once held with some aplomb. Last but not least in OGC, David Gossett, David and I have a very long history. You see, back in the fall of 1994, he and I were in the same small section our first year of law school. And so I've known him quite a long time. We saw Pulp Fiction together in the movie theaters in 1994. Little did I know that many years later, we'd have a chance to work together at the Commission. And David is a brilliant attorney, worked in the Office of the Litigation Division, the Office of General Counsel, including as Deputy General Counsel, briefing God knows how many cases, as well as Chief of Staff to our General Counsel. And David, both as the leader of this agency, but more importantly as a friend, I just want to thank you for your friendship over a quarter century of knowing you. I know bright things are ahead of you, and do stay in touch. Email, tweet, phone call, whatever it has to be. We do want to stay in touch with you. From the Office of Media Relations, this one also stinks, but Mark Wigfield. We are in a season of change, yes. Mark joined the Commission under Chairman Powell after working as a reporter covering the FCC for Dow Jones Newswire. After coming to the FCC, he served as spokesman for the Wireline Competition Bureau for 8 years. Saw the light and then moved to the Office of Media Relations as the deputy director there. In OMR, as our press knows, he's been the press lead on some pretty light, easy to explain issues, special access, USF-funded programs, wireline tech transitions, and something called the Restoring Internet Freedom Order, which I know was a ball to deal with. He's really done a great job. In addition to that, he is an avid athlete, accomplished triathlete and outdoorsman. I always panic whenever I bike into the office, and I fear seeing him down there and he's going to look at a decrepit 46-year-old chairman and wonder, why on earth is this guy on the road? But Mark, I do want to thank you for your service, for your wise counsel, and I know the press will thank you as well for your accessibility. Congratulations on a job very well done. And next in OMR, if we had a series of Mad Men that we were going to have here at the FCC, there's no doubt in my mind the first character cast would be Neil Grace. Neil is leaving the Commission after 8 years. He joined us from Burstyn Marsteller and served as a press secretary to former Chairman Janikowski. He then transitioned to Senior Communications Advisor in the Office of Media Relations, where he's led our engagement work on wireless and media and tech and international issues. He's excited to no longer be inexplicably but routinely confused for Will Wyquist. And he will, as he's put it, this is not my writing, but he will never again have to coach an FCC chairperson on how to look good on TV or translate an FCC acronym into plain English. In addition to that, he's clearly the most dapper person here in this agency. He'll still be here in DC, so we can all live vicariously through him. And Neil, it's been great working with you, and we wish you well in your next endeavor. The Office of the Secretary, OSEC, it's where it all gets done. Angela Robinson is retiring after 30 years at the FCC. She's the person behind eDoc's help, and she's provided tireless commitment to the accuracy and completeness of information in that system, which is, of course, important for everybody inside and outside of the agency to know our work. She's the person who makes sure, especially on meeting days, that all statements and items and all the other documents are accurately posted and available on eDocs. Angela, if you are here, we want to thank you for your service, and excellent. We wish you all the best in the time to come. The Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Chris Anderson. Chris is retiring. There we go. He is the... He's a chief in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau's Operations and Emergency Management Division. He joined the FCC in 2014, and he is recognized throughout the industry as an expert in national security and emergency preparedness and response. He's led the FCC's efforts through disaster response efforts to include Hurricanes Matthew, Harvey, Irma, Maria, Florence, and Dorian. And I had a chance to personally see his work when he and I went to a trip in Puerto Rico. I can't remember which one this was, whether it's 2017 or 2018, but spending time on the ground with Chris, seeing him interact with our counterparts in Puerto Rico, seeing him understand the challenge that folks on the ground were facing, internalize that, and translate that into action back here at headquarters. I can tell you that the American people have been very fortunate to have somebody like Chris at the head of this public safety group. And so, Chris, thank you so much for all you have done, especially when people are facing the worst of times. In the Wireline Competition Bureau, Elizabeth McCarthy joined the commission in 1999. She served in the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Media Bureau, and the Enforcement Bureau, where she was a legal advisor to the bureau chief and the assistant chief of the Investigations and Hearings Division. She's a USF expert, having worked on rural healthcare, high cost, Lifeline, and the E-rate teams during her career in the Telecommunications Access Policy Division. Elizabeth, thank you for your 2 decades of service, and we wish you the best as you depart the commission. John Hunter is retiring after 26 years of federal service. Throat gets dry. Whew. John is retiring after joining the commission in 2006 as the chief of staff and senior legal advisor on wireline issues to then Commissioner Robert McDowell, which is how I got to know him. He joined the pricing policy division of WCB in 2009 and has been a key member of the division's management team working on wireline pricing matters, including separations and access stimulation. As those folks in the office know, there's no better serendipity than running into John in the hallway or on the elevator. He's one of the kindest people you will ever meet. The world could use more people like John. From the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Scott Stone is leaving. I don't know if Scott is, yes. I envy Scott for several reasons. Number one, I never saw him wear a tie. I would love to get away with that. But number two, and more importantly, he has served with such distinction currently as the Deputy Chief in the Wireless Bureau's Mobility Division. He joined us in 1997 and is recognized as an expert across the industry in aviation, maritime, private land mobile, and personal radio matters. In fact, a lot of the emails I get from folks on the outside asking about this or that amateur radio issue, we routinely forward to Scott, who handles them with the delicacy and expertise that those inquiries require. Thank you very much, Scott, for your service. Mike Regic is retiring after decades in the private radio, public safety and homeland security, and wireless bureaus. I'm not sure if he is here, but he's currently the associate chief in the WTB's mobility division, responsible for private land mobile, aviation, maritime, and personal radio licensing. And last but not least, Dawn Keller. Dawn is retiring after 38 years with the commission. She focuses on licensing as an industry analyst in WTB's mobility division. Again, apologies for taking a while, but I hope folks would appreciate inside the building and certainly outside the building that these are the best and the brightest at the FCC. They are what it means to be a public servant, and I think the very least that any chair could do would be to recognize them, to thank them for spending so many years serving the American people here at the agency. So thank you all for what you've done. With that, with that, I'd like to thank the Academy for, no, I'm just kidding. With that, Madam Secretary, could you please announce the date of the next FCC agenda meeting?
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Thursday, January 30th, 2020.
Until then, we stand adjourned.
Exactly. All right, everyone, good afternoon. If you wouldn't mind, please taking your seats. Your conversations outside, either way. We are ready to get started with the chairman's press conference, and it looks like we are all ready. So I will turn it over to Chairman Pai, who's going to make some opening remarks, and then we're happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ms. Pelkey. Despite this being the festive season, I will not air grievances, but I will have a few minutes of remarks. We're coming to the end of Nick is here. Okay, that's all right. We are coming to the end of a very busy year. This year, we continued to execute on the 5G FAST plan, and in particular, the part of the plan devoted to freeing spectrum for the commercial marketplace. Spectrum initiatives were two of the headliners for our meeting today, as they have been all year. A key push was opening up more mid-band spectrum for commercial use. And as you saw moments ago, we proposed a path for deployment of new services in the 5.9 gigahertz band and took a key first step toward making spectrum from 3.3 to 3.5 gigahertz available for shared use between commercial operators and federal incumbents. The day before I rolled out my plan for the 5.9 gigahertz band, I announced my intent to move forward with a public auction of 280 megahertz of the C-band in 2020. Earlier in the year, we liberalized our rules for the 2.5 gigahertz band, which will take almost 200 megahertz of fallow spectrum in many parts of the country and make it available for commercial use. We also finalized the procedures for an auction of 70 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band to begin on June 25th of 2020. And this past summer, we approved initial commercial deployments in the band. In addition to our mid-band work, we've also been busy auctioning high-band spectrum. In January, we finished an auction of spectrum in the 28 gigahertz band. In May, we finished an auction of the 24 gigahertz band, and we are in the midst, of course, as I mentioned, of an auction of the upper 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz band, an auction of 3,400 megahertz, which is the largest auction in American history. All of these actions on spectrum complement the Commission's top priority, which is closing the digital divide. And on that front, the Commission launched some major initiatives in 2019. This summer, we proposed to create the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which would provide $20.4 billion over the next decade to support high-speed broadband networks in rural America. This year, we approved over $950 million to expand and improve and strengthen high-speed broadband networks in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And just last week, I announced my plans to establish the 5G Fund, which would provide up to $9 billion to deploy advanced 5G mobile wireless services in rural America, including targeting $1 billion for deployments that would be related to precision agriculture. In addition to all that, we have seen a number of important initiatives that benefit American consumers. Most notably this morning, you saw the Commission's unanimous agreement to my proposal to establish 988 as a dedicated three-digit number for suicide prevention and mental health. And I've been overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from elected members of Congress, from agencies, in particular SAMHSA and the Department of Veterans Affairs, as well as a plethora of organizations from across the board, representing everyone from veterans to LGBTQ individuals. There are a lot of Americans who are struggling out there, and I think what you saw this morning was the FCC's determination to make sure those folks know the key message that they should know, which is that they are never alone. There's always somebody out there who can and will help. So I've already gone on longer than I usually do in my remarks. One last thing I should mention as well is that even though I can't go through all of the Commission's accomplishments from 2019, we've done a lot of other things. Security of our networks, making it easier for carriers to block unwanted robocalls, setting a vertical location accuracy metric for 911 callers, reforming and repealing many other outdated regulations. There's a lot that we've done, and we've made a lot of progress. And for all of that, I am always grateful to the FCC's very talented workforce, the best workforce that any agency could ever hope to have. With that, I will open the floor to the last questions for 2019.
Jonathan, go ahead.
Hi, Jonathan Meg at Communications Daily. Chairman Pai, can you just address the rollout of the Lifeline National Verifier? It's a narrow question, but we haven't been able to get answers, and some of the PUCs themselves that are affected are confused. Can you confirm that there are 8 states that are remaining that have not yet had a hard rollout of the National Verifier, and that sometime next year these remaining 8 states will have that? Thank you.
Absolutely, and we'd be happy to give you more detail from our staff that's working on Lifeline, on the National Verifier in particular. But my understanding is that the launch is proceeding apace. We are working with 3 states, California, Oregon, and Texas. And I expect those agreements will be reached and the verifier stood up in those states by the end of the year. But we are making progress. And I think here what is critical to remember is the independent Office of Inspector General report, a part of which said that the implementation of the National Verifier, which again was adopted in the previous administration in 2016, is critical not just to weeding out waste, fraud, and abuse in the program, but also instituting confidence for everybody, FCC employees, consumers, everybody, that people who are getting benefits through the Lifeline program are people who need the help. That is the baseline expectation that everybody has, and that's the entire reason why we've been so focused on the National Verifier. I also want to salute our staff for working very hard with not just state officials, but also CMS and others to make sure that we have other databases that we can ping, so to speak. And that has had a huge and positive impact across the country.
Hi, Ian Duncan with the Washington Post. You cited all those people that support changing the use of the 5.9 spectrum, but obviously Secretary Chow has shared with you serious concerns about that. Are you doing anything to address those concerns, or is she just off base with her worries about the plan?
We have done a lot to address those concerns. Over the past several months in discussions with the Department of Transportation, we refined our proposal so that what you see, or what you will see that is released soon, but even the item that was circulated a few weeks ago, reflected a focus on the balanced approach that the Commission just took, dedicating 45 megahertz of spectrum for unlicensed operations and 30 megahertz of that 5.9 gigahertz band for automotive safety technologies. And that is a reflection of the fact that we recognize there are multiple interests here. And so I think what you saw this morning was a bipartisan commission speaking with one voice about the importance of that balanced approach. And I want to thank the folks in the transportation community, most notably Secretary Chow, for giving us their feedback on a wide variety of issues that were implicated on this topic.
Chairman Matt Daneman, Communications Daily. NTIA wrote the agency just a few days ago saying, in essence, hey, the L-band might not be needed for 5G because the U.S. has been wildly successful in freeing up spectrum for 5G. Two-part question. Do you agree with that assessment about what they're saying about the L-band? And do you anticipate this agency, one way or the other, making a definitive decision on the 35 megahertz that's in question sometime in the near future?
So the two questions actually collapse for me into one, which is that we have received the submission, obviously, from the NTIA, and we will be working with our engineers and technologists to figure out the way forward based on some of the submissions that are in the record. And so I can't tell you what I think of the NTIA submission or what the time frame is, because we want to rely on our career staff to do the technical analysis and then present that analysis to us so we can make an informed decision.
Dave Shepherdson from Reuters. Following up on the question about 5.9, Secretary Chow is concerned that there's the dividing of the spectrum may not ensure that the spectrum dedicated to auto safety is not harmed by the other signals from the other block bleeding into that, and also that this could lead to, I think in her letter to you, thousands of additional traffic deaths a year. Do you feel confident that the FCC has done enough work on a technical basis to ensure that that spectrum block will accomplish the same auto safety goals that the Secretary has?
I do think that the approach that we have taken will deliver significant value to American consumers, not just in terms of unlicensed operations like Wi-Fi, but also in terms of automotive safety. And let's be clear about one thing. The next generation automotive safety technologies, in particular C-V2X, but also, as Commissioner O'Reilly pointed out, even DSRC, those technologies cannot progress unless the FCC does something. And that's exactly what we were doing. We are kickstarting a conversation about that 30 megahertz of spectrum in order to allow consumers to be safer when they get on the road. And so part of the reason why I'm excited about our balanced approach, which we took in recognition of some of the issues that the Transportation Department flagged, is that it will actually open the door to automotive safety technology actually being deployed for the benefit of American consumers. With respect to the other issues that you teed up, that's exactly why we have a notice of proposed rulemaking, to invite feedback on some of the technical characteristics of our proposal, whether it's out-of-band emission limits or any other technical issues, what the impact of the spectral separation of the two services. These are the kinds of things we want to tease out. But we can't tease it out unless we take action. And Congress flagged the 5.9 gigahertz band 7 years ago when I was a baby commissioner. 7 years later, it's time to get something done, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
Howard Busker, Communications Daily. Well, I realize you're probably not going to commit to any kind of timeline on the C-band. Can you tell us?
You never know until you ask.
Okay. Well, I'll ask that, but then the second question
I'm not
is-
going to commit to anything.
Right. I'm glad I could serve as a foil for you. Thank you very much. And then I also wanted to ask that, from a timing standpoint, if you're really going to do an auction in 2020, like how quickly does the FCC sort of have to get the ball rolling in terms of notice and how long is it probably going to take to get things together to actually have an auction?
Well, there are, as you observed, several administrative steps that the Commission has to take before executing on that vision. And what I can tell you is that we are actively working on those steps. And so, again, I would reaffirm what I said previously, is that we anticipate commencing an auction of the C-band in late 2020. And you can infer from that that we are doing the necessary legwork to get us to that endpoint.
John Reed, Bloomberg Law. Huawei has recently sued to block the FCC supply chain order. They argue that the FCC lacks statutory authority, its due process rights have been violated, and that it's arbitrary and capricious. What's your response to those arguments?
I guess I would make 2 points. Number one, or E, using my limited putonghua, we believe we made the right decision based on the law and the facts. We want to secure our ICT networks, and to that end, the FCC, again, unanimously determined that we should not allow the use of USF funds to go to the purchase of equipment or services from untrusted vendors. And I think on the merits, that was the right decision. Or two, I would say that I don't comment on pending litigation, so I can't give you either a comment on the lawsuit they filed or what the prognosis is in court.
Jessica Wehrman from Congressional Quarterly. 2 questions. One's kind of a housekeeping question. Is this a 60, 30-day rulemaking? I mean, meaning 60 days and 30 days in reply, so the traditional rulemaking period? And then also, can you comment as well on the decision to not be technically neutral, to commit to CV2X rather than DSRC instead of just sort of keeping it completely neutral?
So as to the 60-30, it varies from item to item. That's fairly standard. In fact, that's probably on the long end for some of the proceedings that we've got, and we extended it a bit in recognition of the fact that there are a lot of different interests here, some that may not traditionally participate in our proceedings, so we want to give
But your window is basically within the next 3 months or so.
3 months, yes.
Input, yeah. Okay.
Exactly. And so then after that, by tradition, the staff takes stock of everything that's in the record, and then we would make a determination about how to proceed accordingly at some point thereafter. With respect to the second question, I would say, look, a lot of folks here at the Commission, including some of the commissioners, myself included, have seen CV2X in action, and we recognize that there are new automotive safety technologies out there, which is part of the reason why we were pinpointing that upper 20 megahertz of the 5.9 band for CV2X, and in recognition of the fact that there are some folks advocating for DSRC, and the fact that Japan has a dedicated 10 megahertz channel that's used for collision avoidance today, it was important to me to say, let's see on the basis of the cases that each of those advocates bring to the table, whether that additional 10 megahertz slice of the 5.9 band should be devoted to DSRC or C-V2X. And we're hopeful that, again, this balanced approach is one that will benefit consumers, whether they're at home using Wi-Fi or whether they're on the road using automotive safety technologies. Oh, I would also flag as well, I mentioned this in my statement, I do think it's important to say that often lost in this discussion is the fact that this agency has been focused on automotive safety. In my first year as chairman of this agency, we worked on across party lines and with others in the transportation community to devote the key part of that 76 to 81 gigahertz band to vehicular radars. And that spectrum decision is already paying benefits in terms of some of the vehicular radar applications that are being developed out there. And so I don't want this to be construed as a FCC versus transportation discussion. I think we've demonstrated, not just in word, but also in deed, the fact that we stand firmly on the side of automotive safety, as well as all the other great technologies that Spectrum can enable.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name's Toby, and I'm a policy tracker, which is a newsletter about radio spectrum. I wonder if you want to talk about whether or not WRC 19 was a success, and in particular the 24 gigahertz band licenses that have a certain limit minus 20 dBW over 200 megahertz, but the new limits in the radio regulations are going to be minus 33, and if that means those licenses are going to change, and just in general how you think WRC 19 went from the US point of view.
Certainly, I think that there's been a lot of discussion about that particular band here domestically, as you might have heard, but also on the international stage. And I think at the end of the day, I'm grateful to the United States government for going to WRC with a unified position, a position that I believe was justified by the facts, thanks in part to the great work by our Office of Engineering and Technology. And the end result that was reached is one that we believe will allow us to move the ball forward in terms of the 5G development of the 24 gigahertz band. I do think there are some other actors who are in WRC who were looking to essentially slow down or even block the development of that band for purposes of 5G applications and services, and I'm glad that some of those advocates were not successful. Generally speaking, in terms of the overall WRC process, I'm still internalizing some of the feedback that I've been getting, especially from our International Bureau staff and others. And I personally was there, of course, for the first week, and so I have a little bit of a sense of how that went. But I do want to wait a little bit before giving an overall assessment about the process, whether it is a useful process going forward, that kind of thing.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays. Happy New Year to all of you.
Are you going to dance out?
Oh, that's, no, the knees are at risk if I do that again.
And we're going to transition to the Bureau press conference. So for the last time, my colleague Mark Wickfield.
Oh my God, I forgot. Yes. Oh, yeah. Can you stop him from leaving?
Yes, there's got to be some section of the Communications Act, if not the Eighth Amendment, that prohibits him from leaving.
It's
but
not too soon to pass a new law.
Exactly. But no, I do want to introduce, I forgot to introduce Mark at the very end. Mark is just, he's the best, as you guys know, and I really want to thank him once again for his service. A really important liaison between all of you and us, and he's part of what makes coming to work so fun. I really have enjoyed working with him, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Okay, so we have two Wireline Bureau items. Are there questions on the suicide hotline and the Voip Symmetry? Are there going to be any questions on Voip Symmetry? So maybe just, how about on the suicide hotline issue? Apparently not. Okay. So the next item on the agenda is the 5.9 gigahertz item. There are questions on that. And we might as well just lump the two wireless items together. Wireless OET items, sorry. Or, well, maybe not. I'm sorry. That's my mistake. Just OET. Or, come on up. Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Okay, Howard Busker, Daily. I wanted to ask, so there was apparently a DOT red line draft that was submitted, but I was gone for a couple weeks, so I'm just catching up, but I couldn't find it in the record anywhere. Is that filed in the record, and does the draft, or does the final item to any extent reflect stuff that was in that red line?
Yeah, thank you, Howard. So we coordinate the items through the IRAC process, and often there's an exchange of ideas and edits in that. And they don't normally go into the record. The only thing that usually goes into the record is something that is key to a decision, for example, in an order. So, but we had consulted with the staff at Department of Transportation. We made some revisions to the draft, but the substance is essentially the same. The revisions are more in the order of clarifications and additional questions.
I guess I'm confused about something, because, and I think that confused a couple of my sources too, was that it normally, if the DOT were going to weigh in, they would weigh in through IRAC, right, and NTIA.
Right.
So was that an unusual communications then from DOT, or is that just, it just kind of came through the IRAC process?
What often happens is when we coordinate something through IRAC, there can be discussions that follow on with the relevant agencies. So that's not unusual.
And then finally, it wasn't clear from the discussion whether there were any substantial changes over the draft NPRM, but is there anything noteworthy, just, that people should know about before they actually see the item come out?
No, just at risk of repeating myself, it was added clarifications and some additional questions.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, the substance is the same.
Thank you.
Okay.
Anything further? Just a really basic question. So you released this draft at the end of November, and then at some point soon there'll be a sort of final version of the NPRM. Is that how that works? It's new to
Yeah, it's
this
usually
sort of-
like today.
Okay.
Hopefully we'll have it out today, or it's going to be Monday?
Monday.
Maybe Monday.
Okay.
See what power I have.
Well, just for your schedule, Howard.
Okay, anything else? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So how about for the 3.1 item? Okay, Toby, so wireless.
It's actually a lot better for them, basically. No kidding, it's going to take a year to release items after they approve them, and they would never even be made public until that time. Now it's a few days to go.
Nice. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah, hello. It's just to clarify, none of what's in the NPRM makes it more or less likely that the band will be made available on a shared or exclusive basis down the line. It's just about what to do with the current guys who are using it on a non-federal basis. Thank you.
So this item just addresses possibly relocating current non-federal uses from the 3.3 to 3.55 part of the band to other bands, including possibly 3.0 to 3.1 to 3.3.
So
it doesn't address exclusive use versus shared use.
So, and that 3.3 barrier between where the current users are going to go and above it's going to be cleared, or it might be cleared, is the 3.3? You shouldn't think from this that above 3.3 will be exclusive and below 3.3 will be shared or something like that. It's a difference.
No, that is not what the item is suggesting, and we're still waiting to receive analysis from NTIA about the feasibility of relocating or sharing on the part of certain federal uses in that entire band.
So finally, sorry. So the 3.3 is just because the studies are starting above 3.3, so that's where you're starting your work, or is there some other reason why 3.3 is chosen?
Well, clearly one of the things that we acknowledge in the item is that NTIA started its studies about the feasibility of sharing in the entire 3.1 to 3.55 band by focusing on 3.45 to 3.55. So it appears that that is more likely to be made available more quickly, and so it seemed that it would make more sense to focus on clearing the upper portion for non-federal uses as well.
Thank you.
I have a question as well. I guess I just wanted to make sure I asked this since you were, I'm a little confused about what exactly you're expecting now from NTIA that would, that'll provide further insights here?
Well,
What is, what's NTIA supposed to come back to with for you
So,
now?
under the Mobile Now Act, right, the FCC and the Commerce Department are supposed to consider the feasibility of possibly making shared use of 3.1 to 3.55. And NTIA is supposed to do certain studies concerning the technical feasibility of sharing that band. To date, they've announced they're working on a study for 3.45 to 3.55, so that's the one that we will be receiving first.
And the study is expected to include its recommendations then?
We won't know until we see the study and it hasn't been submitted publicly yet.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions on the Media Bureau item, the cable notifications? Okay, and how about for Enforcement Bureau items? All right, I think we're done with the bureaus and the commissioners are waiting.
Happy holidays, everyone. Buried in your computers. There we go. Can we answer any questions you may have? Shall we
Commissioner O'Reilly.
start there?
Hey, snooze lose. A piracy question.
Okay.
As you had indicated during your statements, usually the FCC doesn't actually get proceeds from the fines that are levied. Thus, what's the value or the point of large fines or escalating these fines or making a show of levying a 9-figure fine if it's
Right.
if it's theater?
So I won't say it's theater. I think we do. We have had success collecting, and many times, a number of instances, they've settled. In my conversations with folks in different bureau offices, field offices, I've gone and people will pay. There is a way to cut. They have settled. But the answer is we have to heighten the importance of our activities and give a signal that it's not a $15,000 fine or a $10,000 fine, which they have been passing off to different people within their little shop of perpetrators of this activity. So we can't get DOG's attention to heighten it to actually get collection. To your point, we can't. It's like how do we elevate the issue, and that's what something Congress is considering in terms of giving additional forfeiture status and forfeiture penalty in terms of monetary. So right now, you look at the difference between the three items on enforcement. $151 $5 compared to $9.9 million for spoofing. And there, I think that is a signal to the community that pirate radio is not as important as it needs to be. The ending of its practices are not being treated similar to other activities, and that's problematic. So in the case of Boston, I was there not too long ago talking to the folks in the field, and they said, we know there are five pirate radios that have been here over a decade, and we know where they are. We're just trying to get heightened attention. And that's why you see good work by the chairman today to bring forward 2 NALs, and hopefully we'll have further coming in the near future. Does that help?
Howard Busker, I had a question. First of all, Commissioner O'Reilly, someone else asked the chairman about WRC, and because when last time we talked to you, it was like a day or so after you'd gotten back, and in retrospect, looking at things a little more, having a little time to reflect. Do you have any other thoughts on the WRC process and how it's sort of worked out in terms of U.S. priorities?
Well, a couple things. One, I would separate the process from the substance. I think the process was problematic, and I've given a speech on this and comments I gave him just yesterday on the topic. So I think the process is incredibly problematic going forward, and hopefully I'll be able to provide advice to the next structures to get to WRC 23 and how we should approach that. In the meantime, I think the United States would be well within its rights to consider other alternatives. I've suggested a G7 type formulation or other kind of loose coalition amongst the spectrum leading nations to potentially step outside of the ITU if they're not going to have a function or a process that's actually going to be conducive to our benefit, our national interests. In terms of the substance, I think it's a mixed bag. I think some instances the agenda is incredibly large, and I testified to that. It's over 40 items. Many of those worked out in our favor. But the top 5 items from my perspective were somewhat problematic. The question that was posed to the chairman, the landing spot, I think came from how do we end in 24? And I think it's incredibly problematic. That we had a unified government position for the United States of -20. The landing spot at the end of the day is a -33 and a -39 in 8 years. So if you were to deploy 8 years from now, you're going to either have to redeploy or rip out what you have. That's incredibly problematic to those that are serving, that have bought licenses in our auction, especially on the one portion of the band. Some of the licenses are closer to the problem areas than others. And so that to me is incredibly problematic. And we have a dogma, a couple countries that are trying to use the ITU process to make it worse going forward, already trying, after we left, there's the allocation of where the studies go to and where, in the particular studies that I talk about here, where they're allocated, who gets to do the studies. In terms of the ITU, you get one, you get one, you get one, and how they divvy up the responsibilities. They were already trying to undermine the work that the landing spots, which are already found problematic. They're already trying to undermine those from a couple countries, and so this entire process has been harmful from other agencies within the U.S. government, not matching up with the engineering that we've demonstrated, and the rhetoric that has gone on here, but then to spread that internationally, incredibly problematic, and I'm disappointed where we're landing, and it's going to be harmful to 5G services in the millimeter wave, certainly in 24, and I worry what it means for future passive bands. We're able to go around to do some, prevent bad things from spreading into 37, 39, but I don't know what that means going forward. Does that help?
Yeah, and then I just also wanted to ask both of you about some 5.9's not out of the way, but you took a big step on that today. 6 gigahertz, it seems like it continues to look really complicated, and the noise level doesn't lessen on that. Right. Where do you see things are at? Where are things right now as far as 6 gigahertz? And do you have faith that it's
in terms of a timing issue? I've got to give to the chairman. That's his responsibility. I believe the conversation has matured extensively, and I've been part of those conversations for a long time. I've been pushing this issue before a lot of others, and so I'm excited about where we're about to land. I'm excited, and I believe there's something we can do in Q1 of next year, but I leave the exact timing up to the chairman. In terms of the substance, I think that the landing spot is being worked out and trying to find the right math, and that's what I testified to. If we got rid of the hyperbole, we got rid of all the sensationalism, we can get to the right mitigation mechanisms and the protections that's needed from different types of unlicensed, because it's not just monolithic unlicensed, it is a number of different technologies, a number of different situations and scenarios, whether it's inside or outside, and super low power, so there are different scenarios, and we can work through those and produce a benefit that protects incumbents, which I'm fully in support of, while also introducing in this needed band, given its location and the propagation characteristics for new unlicensed services. So I'm really excited, and I think we're just about ready to turn the corner. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the opportunity in 6. I've had some very productive meetings recently with some of the power company incumbents that are in the band. And I think I talked a little bit today as well in my 5.9 statement about why I think 6 is so key and why, from my perspective, it's part of a 5G ecosystem that we need to develop. And getting more wide channel unlicensed bands out there is a key complement to the license strategy that we're pursuing on 5G as well. And so I see the opportunity here for a significant win for the innovations that unlicensed and 6 can help unleash. And obviously we are continuing to work through the engineering and work through the math, but I'm happy, generally in terms of directionally where we're going, but there are still decisions to be made on that band.
Thank you.
Can I ask you both about the T-band auction that Congress has ordered and your concern? And do you share the chairman's concerns about if the Congress does not cancel that auction, that the proceeds from any such auction would not be enough to relocate the various agencies that are using it?
You know, I, unlike a lot of people, I wasn't, there at the table during the original T-band discussion, but I can tell you, even from where I was sitting, there were some, tough compromises, some tough decisions, some back and forth to reach the place where Congress landed. And of course, I think we need to be coordinated with congressional leadership as that issue moves forward. I haven't, positioned myself or released a public statement on what I think directionally is the right approach there. I think whatever approach we do, we should be coordinated with those that, we're negotiating at the table on those issues.
Well, I would say it this way, I don't have the data the chairman has, and and I just accept him as faith that his points are right, but so I don't know exactly, to your point, whether that's the case. I was there, and we did make some trade-offs as a staff and recommended to members who then voted for this. It's a statutory requirement. I can't do anything but follow the statute, absent someone, changing it. I do think, and have, talked about what should be part of a package. If it's not just something that you address on T-band, I think there's other scenarios that have to go into that. I'm hopeful that they'll act, as I said, to Congressman Walden's point on 911 fee diversion and the 4.9 band, and a number of different things that should be part of a conversation if we're going to address the T-band. But I'm just providing advice. They are the legislators. They get to decide.
With the 5.9 spectrum, if you're able to open up the part of that to C2VX, is there anything that the Commission can do to kind of encourage people to actually use it, or is that on DOT and NHTSA, do you think?
I think it went to Howard's point, what changes maybe in the 5.9 item, and I think that Julie said there's additional questions added, and yes, and I think there's two areas that I pushed really hard. One is that we look at deployment issues and how do we get deployment, and so we're not waiting in 20 years. You saw this in my state. We're not waiting another 20 years and realize that it's not happening. And two was to address the issue and to ask questions. How do we get to the issue? Does anyone dispute that this should be safety? So if we're going to have 30 megahertz for automobile safety issues, or they should be actually done for safety. We've had that debate for quite a while. I tried to make that, it seems like an easy conversation. It should be an easy conversation. And everyone will use the magic words of safety when they talk about this issue, but there, it's quite different when we actually pushed the issue amongst the car companies, in terms of the existing 5.9 conversation, they would, we're not ready to do that. We're not going to endorse anything to that nature. So I'm excited about asking the questions. Does anyone dispute that this should be for safety? Because that's what everyone's talking about in public.
Yes, hi. Following up on the WRC 19 and ITU and G7 idea, I mean, have you had any feedback from other countries, other spectrum leader countries about doing this, or is that, yeah?
You're saying is this my own little self-dream that I have
yeah.
myself? The answer is I've been talking about this for a little bit and put a little bit more meat on the bones. The G7 ideas put a little bit more specificity, but I've been talking about we need to reconsider how we approach the ITU and WRC. I will tell you, I had a number of conversations while I was in Egypt, and while other countries are not ready, in my opinion, to publicly state the similarity, and they're happy that I run out there and say things publicly. There were more than a handful that were definitely intrigued by different approaches. We're definitely frustrated, incredibly frustrated by the WRC and how the process moved along. And so they were definitely, there was some serious players and serious countries that were thinking alternatives, and maybe it's not a G7, at this moment, that my idea, maybe it's not, everyone's solidifying behind that, but there were definitely receptivity to some other structure amongst a number of participants. They weren't ready or authorized probably at this time to speak about it. I don't have that withholding requirement.
On the WIA and CTA have those infrastructure petitions that they filed earlier this year to update the Spectrum Act of 2012. Is that something you guys want to see the FCC move on next year?
I'll leave it to Commissioner Carr. I certainly want to. Mm-hmm. We've talked about this. He and I have talked about it. I've talked to the chairman about moving those expeditiously. I'm fully supportive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm really, heartened when you look back at the steps that we've took to modernize infrastructure, the significant uptick that we saw in infrastructure builds from those decisions, not just big cities, smaller towns as well getting 5G, getting next-gen infrastructure on an accelerated basis. So I'm very interested, obviously, in the petitions that were filed. We're going to take a look at the record. That's something that I would like to get across the finish line in 2020, but haven't made final decisions for my own self in terms of timing or direction on those issues. But there's some interesting ones that have teed up in there, and I'm happy to meet and hear from the views of all stakeholders on this. Thanks.
A very final one for you, Commissioner O'Reilly. You talked about exclusive licenses at 3.1 to 3.55. Do you think Congress needs to do something to change the legislation on that so that can happen? Thank you.
Well, yes, I've talked about the need and testified multiple times that we're going to have to add additional bands to our 5G mid-band portfolio. I think that is a next likely case. I mean, I've been talking about the 3 bands for quite a while, the triumvirate. It has been C-band, it has been CBRS, and it's been 3.1 to 3.55. I recognize there'll probably only be a portion of 3.1 to 3.55 for exclusive license use, but I think the top part of that, certainly the top 100, you heard me talk about in my statement, is something that has already been shown and actually offered by other agencies for that purpose. So they've since changed their mind, or if say that everyone's memory is fuzzy, that actually not to be the case. So I envision and have talked to people on the Hill and will continue to do so, the need to clarify that top 100 be licensed, and then maybe need another band of license, but certainly the rest of the band should be fully explored for sharing. Right now, that's kind of why you heard me say in the statement, when we're taking the top part of non-federal users and potentially shoving them to the bottom, I'm not convinced, and the studies aren't suggesting, that we shouldn't have sharing at the bottom either. So that whole band should be explored for sharing. If you heard the conversation from the Bureau Chief, was that the statute requires examination from NTIA and the FCC of the full piece. And what we hear back is what I've said in the statement and what Don confirmed, is that the NTIA is only looking at that top 100 for sharing, and yet we already know from our past work that they were at, there was a readiness or a willingness to potentially make that exclusive for licensing. So that we have far to go in terms of because the other answers aren't easy. Other mid-band spectrum places are not easy. People talk about maybe something in upper 6, but I think that's not necessarily in the cards. And something at 7 is not an easy issue. 12's not easy. Like these other bands that people have raised are not are far harder than the bands that we're talking about now. Anything else for the good of order before the holiday season? Well, I wish you well with all your duly families and enjoy. We'll see you at the beginning of the new year.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello. A long morning into afternoon, so how can we help you?
Commissioners, a question for both of you, similar to what I asked the chairman. I'm curious if you have thoughts on the NTIA letter to the FCC regarding the Legato L-band, particularly its take on the U.S. has been very successful on freeing up spectrum for 5G, and thus this Legato spectrum is not necessary. Thoughts, reactions?
I've seen it. I'm digesting that letter and the associated materials from the Department of Defense. Looking forward to seeing what the chairman proposes that we do next.
Yeah, on that as well, don't have any particulars to offer. I mean, I thought that was very curious. I hear consistently from industry the need for more mid-band, and so was curious to see that in that letter as well. But it just got issued just last week, and still trying to, as Jessica said, digest what's going on, and certainly see where the chairman's going to take it going forward.
Howard Biscuit, Tom Daly. I wanted to ask about, I guess, 6 gigahertz and C-band. And do you feel like the FCC is finally starting to make, I mean, I know you've been very critical of the slow pace in the mid-band. Both of you have said that. Do you feel like at this point things are sort of moving in what you see as the right direction? Or is it
Well, I
is it
like
still
to think
too early
that
to
by
know?
drawing attention to this issue, we are finally starting to pay attention. All you have to do is look abroad. The rest of the world has chosen to focus its early 5G energies on mid-band spectrum. because it's got a mix of capacity and coverage that makes it possible to serve both urban and rural areas. We made a mistake by deciding to focus all of our early energies on 5 high bands. We're holding an auction right now of our 3rd, 4th, and 5th millimeter wave bands. The rest of the world is leaving us behind. That has consequences for our economies of scale, our economies of scope, the national security that results from other nations moving ahead on bands where we are not present. It has consequences for the digital divide, and I think we risk ceding our wireless leadership. From where I sit, it looks a lot like we are resting on our 4G laurels and making bad choices about what to do first in 5G.
Yeah, and so would echo that. I think the chairman said June will be the first that we're going to have to first start our auctions. Obviously, when we're talking about the C-band, it's promised for sometime in 2020. And I think this comment has been made before as well, but it's hard to live in a counterfactual world. But now that we are focused on a public auction, in particular for the C-band, we're already behind on that. We need to really get moving as quickly as possible, quickly as practicable, to make sure that we get that auction rolling so that it really can get going in 2020.
Do you think it's going to be difficult to get everything lined up so that there'll be an actual auction by the end of 2020?
First things first, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that we're going to need some clarification of our authority from Congress. That's on 2 fronts. The first is how we authorize compensating the existing license holders under the Communications Act, or alternatively through some adjustment in the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act. So we're going to need some clarifying of just how we identify how they'll be compensated. And the second thing that we're going to need, and we'll need congressional help with this, is how these billions may be spent, and if there are purposes associated with what this agency does, from rural broadband to 911 to addressing the homework gap. So it's my hope that both the House and the Senate are able to work on those issues, and we'll find a way forward.
And are you saying absent congressional action, the FCC won't really be able to schedule the C-band auction like
What I'm saying is I think we have significant legal work to do. If you read through Title III, in particular sections 303, 309J, and some of the provisions that are being bandied about as the place to look for price discovery and compensation, it's not easy. And so if we want to avoid future lawsuits or further delays, the best case forward is legislative activity.
Thank you.
To either one of you, last month the Commerce Department proposed new rules to safeguard the supply chain for various communications equipment. And obviously, Commerce is initially focused on Huawei and ZTE, but the way the rule is written, it can be very broadly construed to cover any number of components of the supply chain. How do you think, using that authority, should the administration take a broad look at, beyond just Huawei and ZTE, or should they focus primarily on 5G equipment?
You're totally right. It was very broad when I read it. What I'm having a difficult time reconciling is how so many parts of this government are moving ahead on these issues of supply chain security, but we're not doing it in sync. The very same week that the FCC decided that this equipment could not be in networks funded by Universal Service, the Commerce Department, for the 3rd time, extended the temporary general license associated with the very same companies that we were seeking to get out of our fund. On top of it, they did come forward with that supply chain ruling, and it was late, just 2 weeks ago. When I stand back and look at this, what I see is the absence of a master plan. And I don't think it's an accident that the bipartisan leadership of the Senate Homeland Security, Intelligence, Foreign Affairs, and Armed Services Committee wrote the White House and said, we need a national plan for 5G security. We don't have one, and all of these small scattershot efforts do not add up.
Yeah, there does seem to be a lack of a connection between what is the broadness and the breadth of that Commerce order and what was our very narrowly tailored focus on Huawei and ZTE. And so there are some concerns about how you're going to actually be able to kind of sync up, and in particular some of the process points that I think are going to need to be further worked through with regard to the Commerce item.
Hi, this is Toby from Policy Tracker. Do you share the concerns about the WRC process and the ITU in general that Commissioner O'Reilly was talking about? And do you have any general reactions to how WRC 19 went from your point of view?
Oh,
Thank
you know, I didn't have a front row seat in Egypt, and it was Commissioner O'Reilly who attended on behalf of this agency, so I'm going to decide that I want to get a little further review of exactly what went down before we offer that kind of thing.
Similarly, you know, obviously the chairman and Commissioner O'Reilly went. Commissioner O'Reilly went at the very end, and he has a specific readout. I haven't been able to connect with Commissioner O'Reilly on that yet, although I do look forward. I know he's eager to talk about his expectations and the readout and the digest, as well as just getting a broader readout from probably IB as well, but I haven't dug in on that either.
Commissioners O'Reilly and Carr both expressed interest in moving forward on the WIA and CTA infrastructure petitions next year. Do you share those views, or?
Are you talking about the Section 6409 petitions in the
Yeah.
middle class tax relief?
Yeah.
We'll see what the chairman puts forward. We're certainly interested in finding ways to make our infrastructure policy sensible, but I would add that the agency's primary infrastructure efforts are either stuck in court or have been shipped back to us. We may need to go back to the drawing board on some very fundamental things first. That's it.
Happy holidays, y'all.
Yeah, all
Thank you.
right.